Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Ethan Williams. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a systems engineer. This story has nothing to do with technology or my work. It has to do with a mountain, one that since childhood I had learned to see as part of the landscape. Mount Shasta in Northern California, or as some call it, the Sacred Mountain. I climbed it for the first time when I was 12 years old on a school trip. I remember the cold, the rocks, the lake. I also remember the strange silence up there. A silence like the bottom of the sea, but dry. Since then, I became obsessed with mountains, not as a professional climber, but as one of those who do it out of passion, out of necessity. That's why for the past few years I started climbing alone in my free time. Mount Whitney, Mount Rainier, Mount Baker. I prepared, trained, learned routes. I never did it to compete with anyone. I did it for myself. On December 22nd last year, I decided to climb Mount Shasta again. I knew that at that time there could be snowfall, and that attracted me. The idea was to climb from the Bunny Flat side, spend the night in an emergency shelter, one that's at about 13,000 feet, half hidden among stones, and descend the next day through the Avalanche Gulch route. That shelter isn't on tourist maps. It's an old metal container that some explorers and rescue teams use in extreme cases. I knew it because a park ranger had shown it to me a couple of years before. It has no bed or light, just a metal bench, board floor, and a rusty sheet metal door with an inside latch. That day the weather seemed stable. I carried food, GPS, radio, thermal clothing. Nothing made me think something would go wrong. I started walking at 7 in the morning, and by 4 in the afternoon I was at the shelter. The sky had started to close up, and an icy wind was slipping between the crags. I went in, secured the door, ate some energy bars, and started reading a book. I had everything planned to sleep there and continue descending as soon as the sun came up. Around 8:30 in the evening, the wind became stronger. It was no longer the normal cold mountain air. It was a howl. I closed the sleeping bag tighter. I tried to maintain heat, but the shelter structure creaked with each gust. At 11 p.m., the wind was a beast hitting the walls. I thought I wasn't going to sleep, so I put on headphones to isolate myself a bit. And that's when I saw it. A folded piece of paper slipped under the door. I froze, not from the cold, but because I hadn't heard anyone approach. No footstep was heard, no rustling. I only noticed the paper when it was already on the floor, moving with the air. I approached. It was a yellow sheet with old edges, handwritten with black pen. Don't open if they don't knock 3 times. Nothing more. No signature, no context, just that. I thought someone was playing or it was a bad joke, but up there at that hour, who was going to be playing? I opened the door suddenly. Nothing. Darkness, absolute silence. The snow was rising like smoke under the moon. I checked the perimeter with my flashlight. No footprints, no shadows. I closed again, put the paper in my backpack, and tried to sleep. I couldn't. At 2:17 a.m., I know because I looked at the clock several times, I heard soft knocks on the sheet metal door. One, then another, then a third. I paralyzed, waited for the 4th knock. It didn't come. I stayed seated, heart racing, without moving. Then nothing. 10 minutes passed, 20 an hour. I peeked through the crack in the door. Nothing. I lay down again. At 4:03 a.m., another sheet appeared under the door. Don't answer if they call your name. This time I didn't try to open. I stayed in the corner with the flashlight off. I don't know how much time passed. I heard the wind, the wood creaking, my own breathing, but nothing else. Until at 5 o'clock sharp, I heard a voice right outside the shelter. Ethan, everything okay in there?" It was a deep voice, like an older man. I thought it could be some park ranger or rescuer, but something stopped me. They hadn't knocked on the door even once. "Ethan, answer if you can, or we're going to come in." I clenched my fists. My name wasn't anywhere. I hadn't even said it out loud since I climbed up. How did they know my name? I approached the door silently. I put my ear to it. On the other side, no snow or footsteps or panting was heard. Just that voice. "We saw you from below. You have to come down. There's already a storm." And then I knew it. Something was wrong. That voice had no breath. It didn't make pauses, no tiredness was heard, and it had an empty tone, like someone imitating a human. I backed away and said nothing. After a minute, the voice left. It didn't move away, it simply stopped talking. The wind returned, and with it, terror. The sun took an eternity to rise. When dawn broke, I ran out with the equipment ready. I left the shelter without looking back. When I reached the trail, I turned on the GPS signal. My phone was dead even though the battery was charged the night before. I reached the first signal point at 10:30 a.m. I called my brother. I cried. I don't even know why. I just needed to hear a real human voice that would talk to me like before. I went down without looking at the sky. I didn't return to that shelter. Weeks passed before I could sleep peacefully. I dreamed about the door, about the sheets of paper, about the voice repeating my name. I consulted mountaineering forums, groups on networks. Nobody knew about the shelter I described. Some said that container had been dismantled 2 years ago. Others assured that it never existed. I told an old guide I met on a hike to Mount Diablo. He looked at me seriously, without mocking. "Sometimes places keep memories that don't want to be seen," he told me. "Not everything up there is for us. Some shelters don't protect, they trap." I showed him the sheets I had kept, the 2 notes. He told me to keep them well, that if someone else receives them, they can know it already happened to another person. Since then, I haven't climbed alone again. Sometimes at dawn, when everything is silent, I think I hear my name from the street, from the living room, from some crack in the building. But I don't answer, because I learned something on that mountain. What you don't see doesn't always ignore you. And if you ever reach an empty shelter on Mount Shasta, if you receive a sheet under the door written with shaky handwriting, listen to it. Don't open, don't answer, and above all, don't stay until they call your name. Almost 4 months passed since that night in the Mount Shasta shelter. I didn't climb more mountains. I stored the equipment in a closet, and I tried to continue with my life. I went back to work. I avoided talking about the subject with my mountaineer friends. I even stopped looking at photos of routes or landscapes. But everyone who has climbed a mountain knows that's temporary, that the body forgets, but the head doesn't. One Sunday in April, I went to downtown San Francisco to have breakfast with my brother. After breakfast, we passed through the ferry building market. In one of the aisles, next to the stalls selling vintage books and maps, there was a gray-bearded man selling old books about geography, local history, and mountaineering. Curious, I started browsing some. Among them, I found an old pamphlet from the 70s with the title Unofficial Refuges of Mount Shasta. It wasn't registered as a formal publication. It was more like a compilation typed on a typewriter with hand drawings. But on page 12, something was mentioned that made me break out in a cold sweat. On the west face at 13,200 feet, between two petrified lava promontories, there is a container that served as temporary shelter for the Crater Road construction team. Although it doesn't appear on current plans, it was used until 1983. Several informal reports refer to incidents related to auditory hallucinations and anonymous written messages. Its use is recommended to be avoided. I showed this to the man at the stall. He told me that pamphlet had been sold to him by a retired explorer from Mount Shasta City, and that many of the shelters mentioned no longer existed. I offered him money for the booklet, and he accepted without arguing. I didn't open it again for several weeks, but from that day, I knew that what had happened to me wasn't an altitude hallucination or cold. In early May, I received a message on Instagram from an account with a generic name, Mountain Heights. It had no posts, but the message said, "Hey, I saw your comment on the Mount Shasta forum. You also got a sheet left in the shelter. I need to talk to you, please." It was hard for me to remember which forum it referred to, but one night I had left a brief comment under a pseudonym in a group of mountain hikers. Has anyone received anonymous messages in Mount Shasta shelters? No details. I thought nobody would read it, but someone did. After doubting, I responded. We met at a coffee shop near Golden Gate Park. It was a woman about 28 years old, thin, with a clear voice. Her name was Miriam, a geography student and amateur mountain photographer. She told me she had climbed Mount Shasta in January, 2 weeks after me, and that a storm forced her to take shelter in an abandoned container that seemed older than useful. I got there by pure chance, she told me. I was guided by an app that marked old trails. I saw the container and went in. She spent the night there, and things happened to her too. At 2 a.m., she heard footsteps, then a knock on the door, then a sheet of paper, "Don't follow his voice." She showed it to me. She carried it in her backpack inside an envelope, same type of paper, same handwriting. When she saw it, she got goosebumps. "Did you also think it was a crazy person or a prankster?" I asked her. I thought so until I heard my dad's voice. He had died 2 years before, but that dawn his voice was talking to her from outside the shelter, asking her to open, that he was cold, to let him in. I didn't open, I didn't say anything, I just covered my ears. When dawn came, there were no footprints, nothing. We were quiet for several minutes, each processing in our own way. Then we decided to investigate more. Without much expectation, we started looking for other mountaineers who had been in that area, that shelter, or who had similar stories. Most didn't believe us. Some said we surely suffered delirium from hypoxia. Others told us that was typical of being dehydrated. But one person did write to us, a volunteer paramedic who does rescues in the Mount Shasta area. We met with him at his base near the town of Mount Shasta. He was a serious man, weathered, with scars on his hands and eyes of someone who has seen more than he would like. "Yes, I know about the container you're talking about," he told us. "It's not official, but it's still there, although it should have been dismantled years ago. Nobody claims it. Nobody maintains it. and more than once we've had to go up for people who stay in it and come down with panic attacks or strange symptoms. We asked him to be clearer. You don't understand. There's something at that point, at that exact piece of mountain, something that's not explainable. People hear things, see shadows, receive messages, and it's not delirium. There's a pattern, and the worst thing is that it's never the same message. Each person receives what they shouldn't hear. He showed us an unofficial report from a climber 4 years ago. She also spent the night there, left a diary. The last entry said, "It's not me who's writing." The notebook was found in her backpack. She was found 400 yards from the shelter in a state of shock, with hypothermia and no memory of what happened. Miriam and I left that meeting with more questions than answers, but what we had clear was that something happens in that place. It's not a ghost, it's not a legend. It's a point on the mountain where the rules of reality bend, where the mind receives messages that couldn't have come from anyone alive. We decided to go back, not alone. In June, we organized a small expedition. Miriam, me, Victor the paramedic, and 2 more from the rescue group. We climbed during the day with complete equipment, cameras, recorders, GPS, motion sensors, not out of morbidity, but for documentation. We wanted to prove that something occurs there. At 6:12 p.m., we reached the shelter. It was still the same, rusty, solitary, isolated. We opened it, nothing strange in sight. We installed sensors outside, cameras with night vision, microphones. We decided to take turns to watch. I stayed from midnight to 4 a.m. At 2:37 a.m., a sheet was slipped under the door. Nobody outside. We verified it by the cameras later. The sheet said, "Someone shouldn't be here." An absolute silence broke out in the group. We played the video. Not a silhouette, not a noise. But the sheet appears, folded, sliding through the crack. The other notes arrived later, each one different, personal, directed. Miriam received one that said, "Your mother knows you're lying." I received one that said, "You're no longer down below." Since that night, we haven't returned. We delivered the material to a psychology professor from UC Berkeley who collaborates with research groups on high-altitude perception. He promised to review the audios, the videos, but weeks later he told us the backup was lost. Today the shelter is still there. Nobody guards it, nobody claims it. It's outside the official routes. A dead point on the mountain, a hole in reality. I continue with my life, but when I climb smaller hills, I always stop before sunset. And never do I sleep near a door without knowing who can write from the other side. Because now I know it. Not all voices come from outside, and not every message needs an author to be real. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Martin Cooper. I'm 49 years old, and since I was 22, I've been driving 18-wheelers, pure fifth-wheel rigs. I've crossed the whole country and part of Canada. My thing is the highway, badly tuned radios, the engine noise that doesn't let you think too much. I've gotten used to solitude and sleeping anywhere. In this trade, you learn to smell danger from miles away. But that night in Wyoming, that night was different. It was January 3 years ago, but I still have it vivid. I was loaded with sacks of fertilizer that I had picked up in Kansas and had to deliver in Casper through the Wyoming mountains. An ugly route, especially in winter. Cold like a knife. From Cheyenne, the sky was already closing up. And when I reached the area around Laramie, it started to snow. Not sleet, not hail. Real snow, thick, dry, like God had emptied a giant icebox over the north. You couldn't see more than 10 yards. I slowed down, the windshield wipers weren't keeping up. The radio crackled intermittently. At that hour, there was no more traffic, just me, the snow, and the engine. When I reached a Sinclair gas station that sits alone between Cheyenne and Laramie, I decided to stop. It was 11:20 at night. There was no point in continuing. Not even the highway patrol was out patrolling. There were 2 other units parked, turned off. Nobody outside. The convenience store closed, just the green and white neon lights flickering over the snow. I shut off the engine. The silence was total. There's no silence like that of a snowy night in the prairie. It's like everything shuts down. I got into the sleeper, locked up, and wrapped myself with 2 blankets. I put the CB radio on low volume, more out of habit than anything else. After 20 minutes, I was between asleep and awake. And then it happened. First, a little tap on the driver's door, soft, barely perceptible. I thought I was dreaming, but then came another one, stronger. I sat up suddenly, listened. Nothing. I waited a couple of minutes, peeked discreetly through the curtain crack. I only saw the diffuse light from the gas station bouncing off the snow. There was nobody. I thought it might have been one of the other drivers. Sometimes it happens, they ask for tools, ask about a part. I relaxed a bit, lay down again. But then it wasn't a knock, it was an attempt. Someone pulled the door handle hard twice, like wanting to open without making noise but with urgency. I jumped from the bunk, pressed my back against the cab without making noise. My phone was on the shelf. I took it without turning on the screen. There was no doubt. Someone was outside and wanted to get in. I approached the dashboard without making noise. I rolled down the passenger window a little, just enough to look without being seen. And there I saw him. A figure. Tall, thin man with a black hood. He was pressed against my door, had something in his hand. I couldn't see if it was a tool or a weapon. He didn't look like another driver. He had no reflective vest. He didn't have the posture of someone asking for help. His body was too tense, and worst of all, his face was completely covered. I tried to dial 911, but there was no signal. Nothing, just the E for emergency. The guy pulled the handle again with more force, and then he saw me. I don't know how, but he saw me. Maybe he noticed the curtain moved. Maybe it was instinct. He stepped back, pulled something from his pocket, raised it. A metal bar. He hit the door hard. Once, twice. He wanted to break the glass. I jumped to the seat, turned the key. The truck didn't start. 2 attempts. Nothing. The cold had already done its thing to the engine. My heart was beating in my ears. I turned again. The engine coughed, sparks on the dashboard. 3rd attempt. It started. I turned on the high beams. The guy stepped back. For a second, he stood still. Then he ran backward, into the snow. He got lost in the blizzard. I accelerated hard. The rear tire skidded. I felt like I was going to get stuck there, but I managed to move forward. I carefully turned around the parking lot and went straight out to the highway. The snow was thick, but the warm engine gave me an advantage. I didn't stop until I reached the military checkpoint at 25 miles. I told them everything. They checked me, took my information, but said they couldn't do much. There were no cameras at that gas station. Nobody else reported incidents. They offered to let me stay there to sleep. I accepted. I slept little. The next morning, one of the soldiers told me that in that area there had already been similar reports. Drivers who are intercepted at dawn by people who don't steal fuel. Don't steal cargo. They steal men. One of the operators disappeared months ago. Nobody saw him again. His truck appeared empty 2 days later on a back road near Medicine Bow. Another one appeared beaten up, not remembering anything. He said they gave him something to sleep. They stole his documents, his phone, everything, but not the cargo. That was the weird thing. And why? I asked him. Sometimes it's not about what they're carrying, it's about who sees them. There are routes where it's not convenient for someone to pass at certain hours. They see a driver like a camera on wheels, and they turn it off. I left as soon as they let me, delivered the load, and asked for another route for the return. I avoided that gas station. In fact, I've never gone back that way. I learned 2 things that night. First, never sleep with the tank less than half full. And second, that cold isn't what burns most in Wyoming. It's fear. Because in the middle of nowhere, when you're alone, without signal, without help, and someone tries to get into your cab with a metal bar in their hand, that's when you realize how fragile everything is, and how easy it is to disappear without a trace. My name is Samuel Rodriguez. I'm 32 years old, born in a small town on the border between New Mexico and Texas. All my life I worked in agriculture, picking chili, cotton, whatever came up. But over the years, work dried up, crops were lost, and day wages weren't enough for even beans and rice. In 2022, after a whole year of looking for work without success, I made the decision that many make and few return to tell about. I had to cross into better territory, find opportunities up north. It wasn't the first time I'd thought about it, but it was the first time I'd do it. My cousin Tony helped me. He'd been living in Colorado for 6 years and got me the number of a guide in El Paso. He told me he was trustworthy, that for $3,000 he'd guarantee the journey in 5 days. I sold what little I had, an old truck, a skinny cow, and a mare that belonged to my father. Even so, I had to borrow money. I left with a backpack over my shoulder and a promise on my lips. I'm going to come back with money, Mom. I swear to God. I arrived in El Paso in December. Winter there isn't like you imagine it. During the day, you roast in the sun, but at night, the cold bites. A guy in a military jacket with a poker face received me. They put us in a house without windows with more than 20 people inside. Men, women, children, all with the same fear but different reasons. That night they gave us canned beans and stale bread. A bald guy they called El Negro explained the rules to us. We would walk at night, sleep during the day, and nobody should leave the group. If someone fell behind, they wouldn't wait for them. We left at 3 in the morning. The first day we walked in single file along a trail between hills. We didn't talk. You only heard the wind, soles scraping the sand, and the distant sound of coyotes howling. The second day, we ran into a border patrol helicopter and had to throw ourselves on the ground for almost an hour. We'd been 2 days without bathing, without sleeping well, with our throats scratched from so much dust. And the worst was yet to come. The dawn of the 4th day, a young guy from Guatemala twisted his ankle going down some rocks. He screamed. One of the guides approached and slapped him. I told you not to make noise, asshole. Now you're going to make them spot us. The kid couldn't walk. He was crying, begging. And then, without saying anything, El Negro grabbed him by the arm and dragged him towards some bushes. He came back alone. Don't ask questions. I wanted to do something, say something, but the cold had hardened me down to my tongue. That night, while we slept under thermal blankets, I heard someone crying silently. It was the boy's sister. Nobody consoled her. By dawn, she wasn't talking anymore. The 5th day was hell. They told us we were close to a pickup point. We walked from 5 until noon without water under an unforgiving sun. At 2 in the afternoon, we stopped at what looked like an old construction, half buried in the sand. It was a kind of abandoned shed, with remains of a collapsed fence and rusty cans everywhere. Here they're going to pick us up at night, said El Negro. But we need to separate you. Those who already paid stay here, those who didn't come with me. I didn't understand. I thought we had all paid. I already paid, I told him. I sent the money to Don Ernesto, the guy with the number they gave me in Las Cruces. El Negro looked at me with contempt. No, man, nothing came to me. You got cash. I didn't have any. I had sent everything before leaving. They pushed me along with 6 others, all young men. One of the guys pointed a rusty pistol at us and yelled for us to walk. Where are we going? I asked. So they pay what they owe, he answered mockingly. They took us along a loose sand road. After an hour, we reached another more hidden site between the hills, an improvised camp with black tarps, drums to burn trash, and a wire structure with padlocks. It looked like a dog kennel. They put us in there. Welcome to the warehouse, one of them told us while laughing. Here you're going to be until your families send the money or until you serve the boys up there for something. Then I understood. It wasn't just punishment for not paying. It was an extortion network, exploitation. They turned those who got lost or didn't bring cash into merchandise. We were there 3 days, locked up without hot food, with barely dirty water in jugs. They wouldn't let us talk to each other. Only one would come every so often with an old cell phone and tell you to call your family to ask for money. If they didn't answer, they'd beat you up. The 2nd day, I saw them take one away, a Honduran, 20 years old, skinny, who hadn't been able to communicate with anyone. He didn't come back. On the 3rd day, it was my turn to call. I dialed my sister's number in Albuquerque. I told her they had me, that they needed 4,000. She cried. She said she didn't have 500. I begged her to call Tony, my cousin in Colorado. I gave her the number. Hours later, one of the guys came and told me the payment had been confirmed. You're one of the lucky ones, asshole, he told me with a toothless smile. Tonight we'll get you out. I didn't sleep. At dawn, they took me out along with 2 others. They blindfolded us with tape. We walked until we heard engines. We got into a truck. 2 hours later, they took us down near a highway, removed the tape, and told us, keep going that way. If the gringos don't catch you, one of ours will come and pick you up. I went walking without looking back. Everything hurt, my back, my feet, my head. I walked without knowing if I was going toward freedom or toward another trap. 2 days later, in the back of a store in Alamogordo, Tony picked me up. He was pale. He hugged me like I had returned from the dead, took me to his house, fed me, and let me sleep for 3 days straight. What did they do to you, man? He asked me when I finally wanted to talk. What they do to everyone who doesn't have money to pay. Now I live in Denver, but I never registered. I'm still underground, as we say. I work in construction where they don't ask much. I send money to my mom, my sister. And every so often, I sit down to look at the desert from the porch of the room I rent. On cold nights, the wind reminds me of those days, and when I hear a coyote howl in the distance, I can't help but think about the boy they left behind, about those who stayed in that wire cage. There are things that stay inside you, no matter how much time passes. The sand, the cold, the tape over your eyes, the metallic taste of fear on your tongue. That's why I'm telling you, because the desert doesn't just kill with heat. It also kills with silence. And what is silence there stays alive here. I crossed looking for a new life, but I left pieces of myself among stones, thorns, and footsteps erased by the wind. And sometimes I ask myself if I really made it, or if I'm just one more of those who crossed, but never fully returned. My name is Roger Caldwell. I'm 45 years old, from Laramie, Wyoming, and I've been driving 18-wheelers hauling heavy freight across the northern states for almost 20 years. In my life, I've seen everything. Landslides, holdups, animals crossing the highway in the middle of the road, even drug runners blocking roads. But what happened to me at the end of January 2023, on the stretch between Moab and Blanding on Highway 191, I wouldn't wish on anyone. Not because it was dangerous, but because of what it leaves in your head afterward. And I'm telling it not because I want to scare anyone, but because if it happens to someone else, I want them to know they're not crazy. It was around 9 at night, and I was driving alone, pulling a refrigerated trailer with packaged meat heading to Phoenix. I had left that same morning from Denver, but between the dot inspection and the weather, night caught me in the middle of nowhere. That area, for those who don't know it, is complicated. Tight curves, heavy climbs, cold that cuts through you. And in winter, you can be surprised by a snowstorm without warning. I'd had intermittent signal since I passed the junction to Monticello, but I didn't think much of it. I had good diesel, radio in the cab, and a charged phone. Besides, I already knew that stretch and planned to sleep at a truck stop further ahead in Blanding if I could make progress. But when I was going down the grade at mile marker 271, right after a blind curve where the pavement gets narrower, it started to snow. At first light, then heavier, and in less than 10 minutes the highway was covered in white, like someone had shaken a giant sheet over the desert. I reduced speed. The trailer started sliding on every curve. I didn't want to risk it. I pulled over at a relatively straight part where I wasn't blocking too much. I put on the hazard lights, shut off the engine, and prepared to wait it out. I've spent worse nights in the cab. I opened my thermal blanket, served myself coffee from the thermos, and lay down in the seat. Outside, silence. Not even the coyotes were out. And that's when the strange stuff started. My cell phone vibrated. It was impossible. There was no signal. I checked, and indeed the icon showed no service. However, I had a missed call notification. Local number 435-122-3478. I didn't recognize it. I thought it was a system glitch. I ignored it. 5 minutes later, it rang again. This time I answered. Hello, silence. No noise, no static, just clean silence, like someone was listening on the other side but not talking. I didn't hang up. I waited about 15 seconds. Nothing. Then a male voice, hoarse, spoke. Where are you stopped? A sensation ran through me like someone had just thrown ice water on my back. It wasn't what he asked, but how. The voice sounded close, like he wasn't calling from somewhere else, but from inside the cab. I turned around. Nobody. Just me, my blanket, and the lukewarm coffee. Who's speaking? I asked. You shouldn't stay here. Mile 271 isn't a good place to stop, he said and hung up. I was frozen, literally. I pressed the call button, tried to call back. Nothing. The number no longer existed. I started the engine just in case something weird happened. I tried to turn on the CB radio. Just white noise, no station, no trucker talking. I checked the cab's GPS. It had stuck on the last registered position, mile 271, unnamed section. I wanted to believe it was a prankster with a ham radio or someone with a satellite phone, but something didn't add up. Nobody knew exactly which point I had stopped at, and worst of all, there was no signal on my phone, but they had called me twice. I lay down again without taking off my boots, just wrapped myself in the blanket. Outside, the snowfall was getting thicker. The layer on the windshield was starting to block the view. I was going to sleep, but the sound of something hitting the trailer woke me up suddenly. Dry, metallic taps, like someone was hitting it with a rod. I got out with the flashlight, walked around the trailer. I didn't see anyone. The footprints in the snow were only mine. I went back up, locked up, and sat in the driver's seat. I turned on the defroster, and then the phone rang again. 435-122-3478. I answered angrily. What do you want, asshole? Who are you? From the other side, the same voice, but this time softer, more muffled. Mile 271 swallowed many. Don't stay here. Don't you dare fall asleep. He hung up, and this time the phone turned off by itself, like it had run out of battery. I connected it. Nothing. I disconnected it. I checked it with the flashlight. It didn't have a scratch. That's when I started feeling something else. Not fear. It was something else, like something was pushing me very slowly to get out of the trailer, like I couldn't sit still for long. An anxiety that crept under my skin. I moved from one seat to the other. I went out to check the tires. I turned the interior light on and off. I walked in circles inside the cab. I didn't want to fall asleep, not because of the voice's warning, but because something inside me said that if I closed my eyes, I wouldn't open them in the same place. At 2:30 a.m., the snowfall stopped. I went out to the highway. Fog, dense silence, and then I saw something that to this day I don't know if it was real or not. About 30 yards ahead of the trailer, there was another unit. An old white trailer without logos. It looked abandoned. It was crossing the middle of the road with its lights off, but its trailer had something written in faded black letters. 2013 Rescue 271. I approached with the flashlight, but before getting within 10 yards, the trailer disappeared. It didn't vanish or explode. It simply wasn't there anymore, like it had never been there. Not a footprint in the snow, not a tire mark. I returned to my cab almost staggering. I started the engine, put the heater on maximum, and waited for dawn. I didn't sleep again. At 6:10 a.m., another trailer passed. I stopped him, flashed my lights, and the colleague stopped to say hello. He was from Arizona. I told him what happened to me. He just made a serious face and said, "Man, that's happened to several guys for years now." Around mile 271, there's a curve where years ago a trailer fell with a family inside. They were hiding. They never found them. They say that sometimes in winter the lights of their unit appear, or they call the ones who get stranded there. But they don't tell you who they are, just that you shouldn't sleep. I'd never heard it before, and I've been in this business for years. I moved on, reached Phoenix, delivered the load. I didn't tell the handlers anything, just signed and got out of there. Weeks later, I tried calling the number that had called me. The number doesn't exist. I never stopped again at mile marker 271, not for rain or snow. If I get tired, I stop before or after, but not there. And sometimes when I pass through that stretch and check my phone, I find missed calls from that same number, without a ring, without a message. And always when I try to return the call, the answer is the same. This number is not assigned to any user. But someone, somewhere on that stretch, keeps calling me. My name is Dr. Ernest Casting de Parks. I'm a biologist with a degree from UC Berkeley, specializing in animal behavior and population dynamics of large mammals. I've worked in different ecosystems across North America, from the Everglades to the temperate forests of the Pacific Northwest. But the project that marked a before and after in my life didn't happen here, but up there in the Arctic Circle. In 2022, I was accepted as part of an international research team to monitor caribou migrations in the Canadian Arctic tundra, specifically in a strip near the Yukon Territory. The objective was to study movement patterns, dietary changes, and reproductive behavior in response to global warming. It was an ambitious project, funded by universities in Canada, Germany, and the United States, with collaboration from the local government. For 8 weeks, we shared tents, GPS units, field notebooks, trail cameras, and a brutal silence with the wind. But what brought me here to tell this wasn't the science. It was what we found at the 7th camp, what nobody reported, what nobody wanted to admit. We traveled from Vancouver by small plane to Whitehorse, and from there by helicopter to a remote area south of Teslin Lake. From there, the hikes were long and solitary. Each team of 2 biologists was established in an assigned zone with vacuum-packed food, emergency equipment, and minimal satellite communication. We relocated every 5 days to follow the caribou traces at different points. My partner was a Canadian from Quebec named Francois Lemia. Tough, quiet, lover of boiling coffee at any hour of the day. We understood each other well. He taught me to distinguish recent tracks in semi-hardened snow and to smell the air to detect the presence of scavengers nearby. I never saw him scared until that day. For the 7th location, we were assigned an area more than 12 miles east of where we had been before. It was a strip of tundra between 2 hills with low shrubs, snow accumulated on slopes, and a small frozen stream. It wasn't marked as a frequent human transit zone. In fact, according to park maps, nobody had camped there in at least 6 years. We arrived by snowmobile. The helicopter left us 3 miles away because the wind was strong. After 2 hours of walking, Francois stopped suddenly. In front of us, at the edge of a clearing, there was an old camp, but not old like those abandoned due to disuse. Old like those left in haste. Torn tents, a pot thrown yards from the extinguished fire, a raincoat caught in branches like someone had run out, and the wind had torn it off. The fire had been lit weeks ago, maybe a month. No more. We approached carefully. There was no trace of bodies or blood, but there were clear signs of violence. A camp cot bent in an unnatural way. A supply box burst with crushed cans. A wet notebook, barely legible, with scribbles that looked like names and dates, and a message written with charcoal on a flat rock. They weren't caribou. Francois looked at me without saying anything, just nodded as if that confirmed something he already suspected. We took photos, recorded video, noted coordinates, then contacted the operations center by satellite radio. We waited for the response. The response came the next day, after we relocated for security to an area with better visibility. There are no records of groups camping in that sector in the last 3 years, said the park operator. And the team, the tents, the provisions, the monitoring material neither. There are no permits issued or GPS registered. The system doesn't recognize that installation. We asked them to investigate if any team of hikers or biologists had reported losses, deviations, or emergencies. Nothing. No complaint, no disappearance report. They asked us to return to the area with a local park ranger to make a formal report. Francois refused. He said if there was nothing registered, someone had erased that trace on purpose. I didn't know what to think, but there was something that deeply troubled me. In one of the trees near the abandoned camp, I found a trail camera placed on a low branch, almost hidden by frozen moss. It wasn't one of ours. It was an older model, Russian brand, according to the engraving. Francois helped me remove it without moving too much. That night in the tent, with the portable generator on, we reviewed the images. The first photos were normal: a fox, a rabbit, even a black bear crossing at dawn. But the second to last photo, dated October 17th at 3:14 a.m., showed a human figure in the middle of the clearing. Back turned, without a jacket, without a backpack, in a shirt, standing without shoes. And the last photo, taken 17 seconds later, showed the same clearing empty. The figure was no longer there. There was no trace or footprint. The snow remained intact. We kept the SD memory and gave it to the coordination team when they evacuated us days later due to an ice storm. We never heard about that camera again. A week later, when they gathered us in Whitehorse for the final project session, they told us that the camp found was under federal investigation and that we shouldn't talk about the matter. We signed a confidentiality agreement to protect the integrity of the study. I didn't say anything, not on the return flight, not at the Vancouver layover, not when I arrived back in California. Today I live in San Francisco. I work as a technical advisor for a native species conservation program. Sometimes I give talks at UC Berkeley, and there are moments when everything seems normal. Until I see photos of caribou, until I see a map of the Yukon, and something inside me shrinks. Who were the ones from the camp? Why aren't they registered? Who does the notebook that said they weren't caribou belong to? And who was the figure that disappeared in seconds? Nobody in the project touched the subject again. Francois returned to Quebec and hasn't answered a single message since then. His researcher profile was deactivated. Sometimes I think the problem isn't that there's something unknown in those forests. The problem is that someone knows it and doesn't want others to know. A month ago, I received a package without a return address. Inside, a USB memory and a folded sheet. The sheet only said, "They weren't caribou and they weren't the first." The memory contained 43 photos of similar camps, different locations, different dates, always with the same pattern: abandonment, disorder, notebooks, silence. And in one of the photos, in a torn tent, the same raincoat I saw hanging at the 7th site camp is visible. On the floor in the background, a Mexican passport. Mail. Edmundo casting to sea, my brother, missing since 2014. He was supposed to be in another country, we never knew which one. My name is Claire Aguirre. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a registered nurse. I was born in Phoenix, but I've been living in Alaska for 6 years now. People usually frown when I say that, like a Mexican American couldn't survive more than 2 winters in the cold. But you adapt to everything, to ice, to solitude, even to fear. I moved to Alaska after a scholarship for a rural health program. I ended up working in a small community hospital in a settlement north of the Arctic Circle near the Kabuk River Delta. The village is called Kilok. You won't find it easily on maps. It has about 280 inhabitants, mostly of Inuit origin, distributed in small wooden houses among low hills and tundra that seems to never end. The hospital is actually a reinforced clinic. It has 2 consultation rooms, a small emergency area, and 2 rooms with hospital beds. There's its own generator, shortwave radio, and an old satellite that connects us to the outside when the weather permits. In winter, the weather almost never permits. That's where this story begins. Everything started the second winter I spent in Kilok. It was January. The nights lasted more than 20 hours. By 3 in the afternoon, it was already dark. And by 9 in the morning, it was barely starting to get light with a timid sun that slipped away without warming. The cold was cutting, with gusts that made the windows sound like someone was scratching from outside. During storms, the satellite connection failed frequently. It was normal for internet, phone lines, and even the band radio to cut out. In those cases, we were literally isolated from the world for hours or even days. The first time something strange happened was a night when the wind started blowing harder than usual. I was alone in the clinic. That shift, I had a complete guard duty, and I received a radio warning at 9 p.m. The storm was going to hit hard, maybe more than other times. I prepared myself, closed the shutters well, turned on the secondary generator, and told the 3 patients we had that night, 2 elderly adults and a woman with a fractured leg, to stay in their beds. At 10:20, the communication went out without warning, without interference, just silence. All normal up to there. I started reviewing medications, checking the patients. Then, around 11 p.m., I heard a metallic click, like someone opening a door with a key. I went to check the main entrance. Everything closed, windows well secured. I returned to the nursing room and continued working. But then, at 11:11, yes, I remember it well because I was noting everything by routine. One of the motion sensors in the back hallway turned on. There's nobody else in the clinic during those shifts. Nobody. And the back door has a thick padlock that we only open to receive supplies. It couldn't have opened. I thought maybe it was a sensor failure. They're old. Sometimes they register things without sense. But when checking the internal cameras, an old but useful system, I saw something that left me frozen. The back door opened by itself. The image was blurry, like the storm was affecting the internal signal. The door opened slowly, and although nobody was seen entering, seconds later, one of the hallway lamps flickered like when someone passes under it. I didn't see shadows, I didn't see feet, just changes in the light. Then the door closed. I forced myself to think it was a system failure. I restarted the electrical circuit, checked the door. It was still closed from outside, the padlock intact. And yet, the sensation didn't leave me. It was like someone was inside. walking slowly, without making noise. I checked every room, opened cabinets. Nothing. The patients were sleeping. I thought maybe fear and tension were making me imagine things, but that was only the first time. The second time was 2 weeks later. Another storm, another guard night. This time we were 5 patients. Everything seemed calm. I heard the click again. I immediately went to check the cameras. Again, the same sequence. Back door opening for no reason, light flickering. Silence. But this time I noticed something else. One of the files I had left on the table appeared on the floor on the other side of the office. It didn't fall because there were no air currents. It was placed carefully, like someone had looked through it and then left it there. It was the file of Margaret Annakuk, an 84-year-old Inuit woman who had died the previous winter from complicated pneumonia. I had treated her. It was one of the first deaths I had in Killock. I remembered her case well. The next day, when the signal returned, I checked the access records. No registered entry at the back door. Nobody from the village came. Nobody had a key. I kept quiet, not out of fear, but because I had no proof. How do you explain that something enters when communication goes out, but leaves no trace? The third time I saw it, and that night changed everything for me. It was mid-February. The storm was stronger than ever. The power went out completely. Even the generator failed for 20 minutes. I was left with a flashlight, checking every corner. I was alone, very alone. And then at midnight, I heard footsteps. Not normal human footsteps. Bare footsteps, soft, slow, like someone was walking on the tile carefully not to be heard. But they were real, not imagined, not pipe creaks or wind hits. I pointed the flashlight at the hallway. Nobody. I approached, holding the radio that no longer worked. Then, turning toward the main office, I saw the silhouette of a person standing in front of the medicine cabinet. She didn't scream, she didn't move, she was just there. It was a thin figure wrapped in a dark blanket, long disheveled hair, face hidden in shadows. And she didn't react to the light. I didn't approach, I didn't run either. I said quietly, "Do you need help?" Nothing. I stepped back, closed the door, waited. When I went back in, it was empty. The only trace was that the drawer with sedatives was open and a bottle was missing. The bottle had a code. I looked for it the next day. It never appeared. From that night on, I became obsessed. I started sleeping with the flashlight on, checking cameras every time a storm fell, and I noticed a pattern. Every time we were cut off from communication for more than an hour, the back door opened. One night I gathered courage. I left a cell phone recording, pointing at the hallway. What it captured was disturbing. Nobody was seen. But for 4 minutes, the lights activated one by one, like someone was walking in order through the sensors. Then the camera caught a sigh, one long, very low, and then a word quietly. It wasn't understood completely, but it sounded like something like Claire. I no longer work in Killock. I requested my transfer 3 months ago. I didn't say why. But the new nurse who arrived, a girl from Anchorage, wrote to me recently. She only put, "Did it ever happen to you that during a storm it seems like someone enters without entering?" I didn't answer her. Not because I don't want to help, but because now I understand that it wasn't me who that presence was looking for. She just needed the door to be open and nobody to be able to ask for help. In Killock during storms, when everything cuts out and becomes dark, someone enters and never completely leaves. more than a specific incident or particular case. This is something I discovered a few years ago thanks to a coworker at my office. This is about a practice that was used, I don't know if it's still done, at one of the lesser-known locations in my state. We're both from Texas. I live in Garland, while my coworker is from Sweetwater, a town not part of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. To get there, you have to drive on the highway. And while over time and development, it's become more common for people to travel to that area without much trouble, it's still a considerable stretch compared to other routes, and even more so a few years ago. On a certain part of the highway towards Sweetwater, there's a place called the Boneyard, which many locals here don't know about. I suppose only those who pass through there know about it. It's somewhat known because it's an area where animal bones are burned in the open air. Bones that come from places where they slaughter animals raised for our consumption. A practice that I personally consider risky because it can get out of control. It pollutes a lot. And although they say this site processes remains responsibly, many speculate, including myself, that it's not the case. This is due to the terrible odors that emerge from the area, spreading throughout the highway and nearby neighborhoods. This nuisance even made it to the newspapers once, because many people in the area complained about it. Now that you have context, this coworker told me he started becoming familiar with the Boneyard when he was studying at the University of Texas. Since he passed through there by bus every day on that part of the highway, and almost always coincided with when these odors were released, making his commute very unpleasant. That's when he started asking about what that place was and how it worked. So eventually he got to know and talk with people who worked there, as he was genuinely interested in the space, since at least around here we don't know of many companies dedicated to this. What interests us about this whole matter is the fact that he met one of the workers who several times told my coworker that sometimes it became impossible for them to burn all the remains, that they had no way to incinerate most of them. So they started looking for other options so they wouldn't accumulate. One would think that maybe it was about something illegitimate, that they threw them into some vacant lot or buried them on private land without anyone noticing. While he didn't say they didn't do that, it wouldn't surprise me if they also did things like that. However, my coworker told me that this worker explained that one of the businesses they have under the table is selling parts of these bones to people who work in witchcraft. I don't know if Santeria or similar things. He told him that some of these people contact workers like him, where they slaughter the animals, but they make special orders. Because while the goal is for the animals not to suffer as much, they ask them to get certain parts from animals that don't die quickly, but from those that take longer in the process. As he told me, he did several of these orders that paid him very well. They asked him for parts from animals that suffered while this was happening, because according to them, those were the most suitable for work intended to harm someone. What was most valued and picked up at dawn there on that highway were cattle heads. The bigger and with these characteristics I mentioned, the better for them. The company never found out about this. For them, these were things that were going to be discarded anyway. This coworker told me that this worker, who he met frequently through his commute and got to know through these practices, told him that this business was leaving him very good money, that these practitioners came very frequently to that highway and each time offered more to be first in line for those orders, which weren't few precisely. This was every night, but when he left the boneyard at dawn, after weeks of starting this work, he would drive through that stretch alone. He constantly began to see animals throwing themselves at his car, coming out of nowhere, from the darkness, from the sides of the highway. He did have to swerve on more than one occasion, because he frequently saw pigs and cows watching him on the road, when it wasn't common for there to be loose animals around there. One day he arrived at work as usual, attended to one of these people who frequented him most at dawn for these deals. He hadn't told anyone about this, but when he was leaving, a woman, a witch as he called her, told him out of nowhere that he should take a break, assign someone else to these orders, and pay them a part because it was noticeable that it was affecting him. This worker asked the woman after she paid him how she knew, and the woman told him that anyone could tell that the animals were weighing on him, and that was because he was focusing all his attention on these orders, on the little animals that were suffering the most, constantly comparing them. Later, this man told my coworker that he wasn't proud of it, but since it was difficult for some animals to die quickly with the methods they used, he had to get creative, because he said that at first the practitioners could tell that the animal hadn't died under the conditions they wanted. I won't say the details that my coworker told me, but he had to do some additional things for this. This woman, out of gratitude for giving her preference during the time he had been selling to her, regardless of others paying a little more, a few days later gave him a type of ointment to apply while driving and sleeping, among other instructions. After staying away from all this for a while, he stopped seeing those animals on the road that weren't real, but which he said were the spirits of the poor little ones he had made suffer for these orders. He made a lot of money, and then retired because he said maybe it wasn't so much about the animals that started weighing on him, but also about making deals frequently with these people, seeing them for this purpose every night there at the boneyard on the highway. From what I learned, they're still doing it, but I don't know if the special orders are still part of that business. We'll always learn about paranormal things, about people who surprise us, but for the worse, as in this case. Let's hope things aren't continuing like this anymore. Have you heard anything similar? My name is Alex Valdez. I'm 37 years old, and for more than a decade I've worked as a field technician for a telecommunications company based in Denver, but with reach throughout the western states. My specialty is maintenance of repeater stations, microwave antennas, radio towers, backup systems. I'm almost always on the move, checking nodes in remote locations, forest roads, or places where not even the wind is heard. It's hard work, solitary, but well paid. And that, for someone like me who has no wife, no kids, and no desire to be in an office, is perfect. What I'm going to tell you happened in January 2024. I was assigned a service call at one of the most remote towers in Colorado, almost at the border with Wyoming and Utah, in a region known as the Flat Tops, near the White River National Forest. The name isn't coincidental. In winter, that area is pure ice. If you don't bring thermal equipment, you freeze in less than an hour. The antenna I had to check was at about 9,200 feet above sea level, on a snowy plain with restricted access. You could only get there in a 4x4 truck equipped with chains, and the last 2 miles had to be done on foot or snowmobile. Fortunately, the company equips us well. They gave me a Polaris, long-range radio, GPS, provisions, and an emergency key for the power shack that's next to the tower. I left Denver on a Tuesday morning. Driving to the access point took me almost 3 hours. From there, I launched on the snowmobile, making my way between pines sleeping in frost. With that dry silence that forms in the mountains when snow covers everything. Around 3 in the afternoon, I reached the tower. I found it operational but with variations in the backup signal. Something minimal, but enough to justify the check. I spent 2 hours working. I checked panels, changed a distribution module, updated the base unit firmware. The usual stuff. The plan was to return that same afternoon, but around 5 o'clock, a heavy snowfall began, strong with gusts that clouded visibility to less than 30 feet. I decided not to risk it. The company has a clear policy. If the weather doesn't permit return, stay where you are. And I had the power shack with a heater. I've spent nights there before. But while walking toward the shack, I noticed something that shouldn't be there. On the other side of the clearing, among the snow-covered trees, I saw an orange light. Not a flashlight. It was the type of light that gives a wood stove, a fireplace. It projected against the window of what looked like a cabin. I stopped. I know the area. I've been up there several times. That cabin wasn't on any map, not in the company records, not in the Forest Service reports. I checked the GPS. Nothing. According to that, there was only forest in that direction. I thought it could be from some park ranger. Sometimes they have scattered shelters, but they get reported. That worried me. The cold was tightening. The sky was closing more and more. I decided to approach. I walked about 200 yards. The cabin was dark wood, very old, the roof covered with snow, the windows fogged from inside. A chimney was releasing thin smoke. There were no footprints around. That made me nervous. I knocked on the door. Nothing. I waited. I knocked again. Nothing. I leaned and pushed the handle. It was open. It creaked with a dry sound. I entered carefully, announcing myself. "Hello, telecommunications technician. Is anyone here?" The heat hit me instantly. A fire burning in the fireplace, a kettle barely whistling on an iron stove, and on the table, a plate with hot soup. It wasn't steaming, but it wasn't cold either. "Hello," I said again, louder. Nobody answered. The cabin was small, with 2 rooms. I checked carefully. Nobody. Everything was in order, like the owner had just gone out to the forest and was going to return at any moment. On a bookshelf there were strange things. Handwritten notebooks, old topography books, a notebook with maps drawn in pencil. All marked routes between hills, paths that weren't in any app or Google Maps. Routes without names. I noticed a detail. All the routes circled a central point that appeared with different labels. The dry clearing, the white eye, the trap. And on one of the maps, right where I was standing, it said, "Don't enter at night." I had a stab in my stomach. I closed the notebook, turned around. On a shelf, I found an analog radio turned on with weak static. Suddenly, among the noise, a voice slipped through. Another one already entered. Which one? The one with the orange coveralls. I froze. I was wearing thermal orange coveralls with reflective stripes, like all field technicians. I turned off the radio suddenly. I left the cabin immediately. I ran back to the power shack. I closed from inside, activated the security padlock, and barricaded myself with a flashlight in one hand and the company radio in the other. I waited. I didn't sleep. I just listened to the wind hitting the outside, like someone was scratching the sheet metal walls with their nails. Sometimes, between the air hits, I swear I heard footsteps on the snow, but they never approached. At 6 in the morning, the snowfall subsided. I left with all the equipment ready to go down. But before leaving, I looked back toward where the cabin was. There was nothing. Just trees, snow, a piece of stepped ground like something heavy had been removed from there recently. But not a footprint, not a board, not ash. I checked the GPS again. No structure registry. I returned to the access point, reported in. I didn't say anything about the cabin. Weeks passed. I continued with my work, but I couldn't stop thinking about that voice on the radio, about how they knew I was there, about that plate of soup served like someone was waiting for me. Until a few months ago, reviewing old maintenance logs, I found a report from 13 years ago from another technician. The file had a margin note written by hand. Don't enter the flat tops clearing shelter. Not registered. Don't return. That technician, William C., retired shortly after. He never gave reasons, but on the last page of his scanned notebook in PDF, he wrote something. There are places that seem like help but are something else. If you enter, something sees you, and if it sees you, it starts looking. Now I'm clear that that cabin wasn't there for me. It was waiting for me. And when I think about what would have happened if I had stayed to sleep, if I had tried that soup, or if I had lingered a few more minutes inside, I feel like I wouldn't be here writing this anymore. I feel like I'd be inside with the others who also entered, and that the cabin, wherever it hides now, would have one less plate on the table. A week ago, I received a message in my corporate email. It didn't have a clear sender, just text. You shouldn't have turned off the radio. We haven't finished with you. I didn't respond. I just went to the warehouse. I asked for a new uniform, this time dark gray without stripes. And since then, I only work in low areas, because I understood that in the north, where cold buries more than snow, there are structures that don't belong on the map. And sometimes when you find them, it's better not to enter, not to touch, not to look, and above all, not to let them recognize you. What I want to share happened while I was accompanying my brother-in-law to visit my sister at my parents' house. Since we started college, we both moved to another city, specifically to Austin, Texas. However, due to my sister's pregnancy, she decided to return to spend a few months in Fredericksburg, Texas. So her husband went every other weekend, making a trip of almost 4 hours by highway. Well, around 97, 98, it took even longer driving. So on that occasion I'm telling you about, I offered to go with him and drive on the way there. He accepted the offer gladly because of how tedious it was becoming to do it on his own. After about an hour, when we were already on the highway, we stopped to eat at a diner he had discovered during these trips, one he highly recommended to me, already in the Texas Hill Country. I was willing to stop and eat there, but I didn't really feel like losing time on the road, which I let him know despite accepting the meal. However, we arrived, and while we were waiting for our plates, it was a diner just off a side street next to the highway. I started checking a map he had in his car and had brought down with me. That's when I realized there was another route that seemed to cut the journey by almost half, well, from that area. It would surely save us at least 40 minutes of travel time. The thing is, I mentioned this to him and showed him the map. He told me it wasn't a good idea to go that way, that he already knew that road, that it wasn't in good condition and was somewhat unsafe due to how deserted it was. But since it was relatively early, it was 11 in the morning, I insisted on taking that route. I immediately knew he wasn't convinced at all, and even told me we should stick with the usual route. He also changed the subject without giving me a clear answer, but I've always been very stubborn. So I insisted a bit more on going that way, seeing how my brother-in-law was getting annoyed. Curiously, while he was telling me no, very politely, one of the waitresses came to refill our coffee, and upon hearing our conversation, she looked at my sister's husband and said, "Let's see if you're still so determined when a little dead one appears to you." He just smiled, and then the woman turned to look at me and added, "It might be a shorter trip that saves you a lot of time, but what you're going to see there will stay with you forever, and not in a good way." I thought this was a joke from the waitress, and was confused when she winked at me after saying this and walked away. "What's wrong with this lady?" I asked, confused, to which my brother-in-law responded that she dared to say what he didn't want to, since he didn't want me to judge him, or think it was some simple excuse. Then he explained that that road was in perfect condition. It really does save you a great stretch. It's just that nobody wants to take it, not even truckers who sometimes seek to cut time to the maximum, since entering there was risky. Since the waitress had mentioned the topic, he could tell me. It was my business whether I believed him or not. The first time I took that road, just like you saw it on the map, I didn't know this diner yet. I was just getting to know all the roads. These were the first times I was coming this way. I was also driving alone in the morning. When I took that road that goes right through the fields and farmland, except there's nobody there. On that occasion, I remember I slowed down a bit because there was a pothole in the middle of the stretch. So I had to pull over and pass alongside the road, putting half the car on the shoulder. When I passed next to that pothole, which something had surely made into a small hole, and over time it had opened up, it was a pothole about 10 feet long, and inside it wasn't that deep, but clearly you weren't going to put your car in there. From inside that pothole came out a child. He was crouched down there. But when I passed looking inside, this child looked up and jumped, grabbing onto the door. I even got chills remembering it because this child, Daniel, wasn't normal. He barely had underwear on. He had hung from the door and was looking me in the eyes, pressed against the glass. I really remember it, and it gives me chills. Look, my brother-in-law showed me his arm, and his hair was standing up. He had goosebumps. He was truly scared telling me this. This child's face, Daniel, is something I'll never forget. He had features I'd never seen on anyone. He had a small face, eyes like he had no eyelashes, eyebrows that were barely visible, and even though I was already stepping on the gas to get out of there fast, he was serious, looking at me. I could hear how he was moving the door handle. But you know, as soon as I get in a car, I put the locks on. That's why he couldn't get in. But no matter how much he was pulling the door, he didn't stop looking at me. I was afraid someone might see me around there driving with this child hanging on my car. But there was nobody. I was alone. I wasn't saying anything either. I would look at him at the road, getting back on the highway, and suddenly he let go. I saw in the mirror that he fell and went running toward the field. I saw all of this in daylight, inches from my face. I drove with the fear that someone would stop me further ahead, that this child who didn't seem like a real child, that's how I would describe him, had somehow told someone around there, and they would come looking for me. But no, I drove alone without seeing a single house on that highway until I connected back with the usual one. When I met this diner, I heard on one occasion one of the customers who was sitting over there at that table near the bar talking with the lady, the owner here. He was telling her that some people who had disappeared on him on the highway had scared him. When I joined the conversation, that man said it had been on that highway. Through that conversation, I became closer friends with the lady. I got to know the waitresses, several people who came to eat, and you saw how easy it is to start chatting with people around here. So I heard several stories from over there, all about apparitions, but none was like mine. That is, they all sounded different, except they were always from over there. That's why when I told my story to the owner, she told me to never take that detour because they don't know or understand what happens over there, but things do appear. At least that's what happened to me. The way his hands trembled when he told me this convinced me. I knew he was telling the truth, and that's why we didn't take that road. There was no other reason for him to want to take longer driving around there. When we left back to the highway, we saw that road and observing how that highway looked as it disappeared among the fields. You could imagine how alone it would be. Well, we didn't save time on that trip, but at least we saved ourselves a possible bad experience. Because my brother-in-law told me he had no idea what could have happened if on that occasion I didn't have the doors locked or had the windows down. How do you imagine this child, this being? There's a particular silence that only long-distance bus drivers know. It's the one that arrives after midnight, when all the passengers in the back have fallen asleep, and the highway looks like a black thread that never ends. No music, no conversations, just the engine and your own thoughts. And in that silence, things start to happen. Some say it's fatigue, that the mind plays tricks with what little it sees. Others never tell their stories because they don't want to be taken for crazy and lose their license. Tonight I bring you this story. And since we're running late to depart, go ahead and turn off the lights or close your eyes. Put on your headphones and let the darkness come. In a recent experiment, they divided a group of people to take a regular subway trip. Some were asked to avoid all contact, not to talk to anyone. The other group was asked to do the opposite, start a conversation with any stranger. At the end of the journey, the results were as clear as they were disturbing. Those who didn't talk got off the train with furrowed brows, more tense, even irritable. Those who talked about the weather or traffic showed a slight improvement in mood. But those who dared to share something intimate, something personal, came out as if they had dropped a backpack of stones they didn't know they were carrying. One of them revealed a secret so deep, so buried, that as soon as he finished telling it, his face changed. He looked like someone who had finally reached a safe place. He died that same afternoon peacefully, as if he had allowed himself to rest after years of walking in the rain. He died with a slight smile and an expression that many described as heavenly, as if they had finally opened the gates of heaven for him. I'm telling you about this study because I was recently reading about it in an article, and then a childhood memory came to me. About 18 years ago, my mother, my brother, and I went to San Antonio on a Greyhound bus. We had to sit separately down the aisle. My brother and I got seats together, and my mother sat with a lady. About 10 minutes after we left the Dallas terminal, the passenger struck up a conversation with my mother, and they didn't stop talking until we reached our destination. My mother, who likes to listen to people's stories, who didn't want to fall asleep to keep an eye on us, and the lady who had the urgent need to get off her chest what she was about to tell. It all started by talking about us, about children, about taking care of children. This lady told my mother that she was from San Antonio precisely, and that many years ago she came to the city one day when her parents kicked her out of the house. She was going to come with a boy, but ended up coming alone. At dawn, she arrived at the bus terminal downtown. She didn't know what to do, where to go, whether to stay or go back. She took a bus that dropped her off who knows where. There she took another one that took her to the east side. She worked a few weeks helping at a flea market, but as she described herself as very pretty, she caught someone's attention. They wanted to put her as a secretary in an office, but she ended up taking care of a lady's children, and she was very good at that. She met those children when they were still babies. The parents would leave all day to work. They had enough money for one of them to stay home watching their children grow. That's what she never understood. But anyway, that gave her work, very good work, and a place to live. One day, the father of the twins died in an accident. The lady said it was horrible, and even made it into the newspapers. As it was, neither of them seemed interested in the children anyway. They felt they did enough by paying her to take care of them. But after the father's death, the lady changed, especially in her treatment of the children. She would hit them. They lived in a big house, and the lady who told this story to my mother had a spacious room in the house with a bathroom, with her own garden, a private space that no one else entered. She said it was her own little house, and she told the twins they were her children. That's why when she saw that the lady was hitting them for almost anything, she went a week without sleep because she felt she should do something about it. One Monday, she got up determined to do what she had been thinking she was going to do. "Don't tell anyone," the passenger told my mother, looking her in the eyes while we slept leaning on each other in the seats next to them, so she wouldn't hurt the children anymore. One afternoon, I came up behind my employer and hit her hard with the iron on the head. She thought that, like in the movies, one blow would be enough. It wasn't. She fell to the ground and started screaming. To silence her, the second blow went to her face. My mother says the passenger gave her chilling details of what she did to that person. My mother was waiting for the moment when she would say it had been a joke and continue with the story, although actually everything was leading up to that point. She talked about the children as if they really were her children. She said that as soon as the adrenaline went down, she panicked. She didn't say it in those words, but basically that's what happened to her. She saw the scene she had created. She heard the sound of patrol cars on the street and thought they had already come for her. Minutes later, she said everything calmed down. It was time to start thinking about what she was going to do if she was going to jail, what was going to happen to the children. A whole week, and she hadn't thought about the consequences. Well, what do you think she did think about? She put her employer in a garbage bag. By the way, 3 days before she bought 10 extra large bags just in case they were needed. She put the body in one, and then in another, and then in another until there were 10 layers. She sucked out the air as best she could. She said she helped herself with a vacuum cleaner. She used 3 rolls of duct tape to wrap it up. My mother swallowed hard, felt fear. The lady didn't have a sinister gleam in her eyes. She was an ordinary person. In fact, if she hadn't opened her mouth, she would have gone unnoticed. The house was big, beautiful, one of those California-style houses in Highland Park. The garden was so beautiful that she didn't want to destroy it by making a hole to bury her. That's why she decided to put the bags and their contents in a box. The box from a washing machine that the man bought before having the accident. On top she put other things, clothes, blankets, toys. She hid it from her sight and that of the children. She said that over time she stopped thinking about her completely. She finished the sentence and fell silent. My mother also fell silent, didn't know what to answer. She could only think to ask, and the children. The woman got up a little from her seat and pointed to a pair of young men who were sitting right in front of me and my brother. They were also asleep. The passenger said that after so many years, she did forget that she had a body stored in the attic. Totally and completely erased it from her daily thoughts. For a long time it didn't cross her mind, not the box, not even once. Years passed, the children grew up, the routine changed, and the memory was diluted. Can you imagine not feeling guilt? My mother took a bitter sip. She remembered her employer the day she decided she wanted to return to San Antonio. She would sell the house. That Highland Park house didn't feel like hers. She said it didn't cost her anything to put the deeds in her name, that the process was simpler than she expected. She started emptying the house, took out furniture, clothes, boxes full of useless things. She burned the ladies' belongings, gathered them in the back patio one moonless night, didn't even pour gasoline on them. She sat down to watch them burn, and then she said, only then did she remember the box, the bags, her employer, the real owner of the house, the mother of the children. That she didn't think about so many years ago when she made the plan. She never wondered what she would do afterwards. She thought about the present, about saving the children, about hiding her. How would she get her out now? What would she do with that? So many years without problems, and now it would be time to face the consequences. She said she stayed in the kitchen with the lights off, thinking about the exact weight of the box. Would it still smell? Would it have rotted completely? Would it be pure liquid inside? Or would it already be dry like old leather? She took a breath and went up to the storage room. It was a hot little room with a low ceiling, right up the stairs. It still had the old furniture piled up, everything covered with dust. She removed the things that covered the box. She expected to find something softened, eaten away, moldy, with fungi growing on the edges, as if they had been breathing inside. But no, the box was old. That's how she felt it, dusty, dry, but intact. She opened the lid slowly. The cardboard creaked as if it were complaining. There was the bag with the same shape. It had passed the test of time. It was still closed, swollen like that, but not broken. She said she thought about opening just one corner, knowing if inside there was meat, water, ash, maybe a mummy. But it wasn't the time, nor the place, nor the state of mind. Then she sent the boys to buy a suitcase. A big one, she told them, one of those with wheels and a long handle. And then there was another silence between my mother and the person, one just like the previous one. Maybe she expected my mother to say, "How brave," or "No way, how strong," or at least "What a story." But my mother said nothing, just swallowed and asked quietly, as if she didn't want the answer to exist, "And what did you do with that suitcase?" The lady didn't answer immediately, looked ahead, then said with a voice that seemed very cold, "It's traveling with us in the luggage compartment." After that, she kept talking as if nothing had happened, as if she had just said she forgot to turn off the stove, or that she had dreamed about her grandmother. She talked about other topics, other things, about sweet bread, about how prices had changed, about the rains in San Antonio, about earthquakes. My mother couldn't stop thinking about the other thing, about the suitcase, about what was traveling with us, that maybe a couple of meters from where we were sleeping was traveling the body of a woman who had been dead for more than a decade. My mother was counting the minutes for dawn to break, because that was a sign that we would be arriving at our destination, and the more light there was, the less that horrible story weighed on her. When we got off, obviously my mother didn't tell us anything, but she was the first to get off. She ran for our suitcases as if breathing depended on it. She didn't want to see the lady or her supposed children, and she didn't want to see the suitcase, but she did see it. It was a common suitcase with wheels, sufficient for the belongings of 3 people who are just visiting San Antonio. The woman and her 2 sons walked away into the crowd of the bus station, dragging that suitcase behind them. And my mother never knew if what she heard that night was true, or just the desperate confession of someone who needed to unburden herself of an imaginary weight. But sometimes, when she passes by a suitcase with wheels in an airport or sees someone dragging luggage behind them, she can't help but wonder what secrets people carry with them, what burdens they've been dragging for years, and what they're willing to confess to a stranger on a long night journey. My husband and I are from Barstow, California. We discovered your channel through the highway stories and knew it was time to share what happened to us. This occurred in 2006, when my husband and I had only been married for a few months. We loved visiting my aunt and uncle who lived in 29 Palms. I'd say it's somewhere between a small town and a city, though it's grown quite a bit since then. It's not like it used to be. To get there, we had to drive about an hour and 30 minutes, and it was always a peaceful drive through pure desert highway. You could forget about seeing any trees out there. One of the parts I loved most was when we passed the wind farm, where those enormous wind turbines are. When we went, it was always in the morning, so they looked beautiful against the sunrise. On this particular occasion, we were driving around 8 in the morning. Because I was paying such close attention to the view outside, I noticed when we were passing through there that there was an old man walking along the edge of the highway. I saw him and asked my husband, "Hey, did you see that old man? Poor guy, where do you think he's going?" This intrigued me because there wasn't a single house near there, just that wind farm. But he didn't seem to be an employee, because this man was elderly and was walking slowly with a cane under the sun, covering himself with a hat, his pants covered in dust. I was tempted to ask my husband if we should stop and ask if he needed a ride somewhere, but my husband told me he didn't see him. I commented that I had looked back through the rearview mirror, and he was the only one walking out there. He was wearing dark clothes, so he would have been easy to spot. But when my husband started looking through the mirrors, he couldn't see him. Neither could I. "Maybe you saw wrong, honey, because I don't see him. Are you sure it was a person?" he asked. I answered yes, but I didn't know what was happening. There was nowhere to hide or disappear from one second to the next. On that highway there was nothing, so I told him maybe I saw wrong, and that was it. We kept driving, and when we passed that wind turbine section, about 10 minutes later, I saw in the distance on the highway. But coming from the other direction toward us and on the side of the highway, staying to our right, the same old man walking hunched over, slow, like he was taking steps in slow motion. It couldn't be someone completely identical. He had that same clothing covered from the knees down with dust from that highway, that beige-colored, very light dust, that sun hat that looked like straw, and that cane. When I told my husband, grabbing his arm, and yes, I know it's very dangerous to do this with someone who's driving, but my shock was so great I didn't consider it at that moment. I told him that there he was, that it was the man we saw behind us. My husband said he could see him, that I shouldn't worry, that it could be someone very similar, but it wasn't like that. It was exactly that same man. But how was that possible? When we got close and were about to pass him, I don't know why, maybe it was because of the fear of what was happening, I was afraid he would turn to look at us, that he would do something, but he didn't. However, from 1 second to the next, even though we had the windows up, the car started to smell inside like death, like something rotting, like what cemeteries sometimes smell like. My husband told me not to say anything, to cover my nose, and not to think about that man anymore, that he would leave us alone now. We continued driving on the highway in silence. In fact, I didn't speak for about 10 more minutes because I was scared. I was still afraid because of that, and when we smelled that thing, after the car had stopped smelling like that, I didn't look back through the rearview mirror. I kept my gaze straight ahead on the road, and my husband said something about stopping before we got to my aunt and uncle's house, so we wouldn't arrive empty-handed, and that distracted me a bit. We stopped at a store in 29 Palms, and before getting back in the car, my husband told me, the old man we saw back there. I believe you that it was the same one you saw the first time. Don't get scared, it's over now. But most likely he got in the car. I didn't see him, but during that stretch when it smelled like that, I'm sure he rode with us for a while. But the good thing is he wasn't evil. Don't worry, we won't see him again. Despite the fear that left me with, my husband was right. The times we drove through there again, which weren't few, even though we were always watching the road, we never encountered that man again. I don't know if after what happened to us, it meant he was finally at rest, or if we just had bad luck running into something that haunts that highway. Have you ever heard stories like this, where they say the dead accompany you whether you want them to or not? On highways, for example, truck drivers often advise each other to always keep the passenger seat occupied. That's why many choose a companion, a stuffed animal that serves the function of preventing something from occupying that seat if they happen to encounter something on the highway, so it won't get in or accompany them. Did you know that? Tell us if you've had a similar experience. My father did everything in life. He was a baker, a boxer, and for some years he drove passenger buses. I've always thought that drivers, especially those who have traveled different routes, are the best carriers of stories. Have you ever talked to one of them? My father had a route that crossed a large part of East Texas. He worked for a small, discreet transportation company with units that were already beginning to show their age. Once he had an accident, that's what we call it, the accident. But those who know how some things operate in certain parts of Texas will know that this word often covers more than it reveals. After that, he left the company and was able to reach an agreement with his boss to buy the bus he had been driving for years. He transformed it into his livelihood. He rented it for school trips, personnel transfers, private trips, and what gives rise to this story? The transportation of funeral processions. A funeral procession is that final journey that accompanies a deceased person from the wake to the cemetery. It's not just a route, it's a ritual in movement. Cars in line, lights on, tense silence. My dad didn't have a hearse. The bus was the same as always, the one he used for everything. It wasn't adapted. It had no special modifications. But when someone hired him for a funeral, which was more common than one would imagine, he prepared it with the help of my brothers. They placed plastic flower garlands on the front, covered the windows with dark fabrics, and put black bows on the side mirrors. Sometimes they also hung a cross-shaped ribbon on the entrance door. Inside, the bus remained the same. The usual seats, the smell of diesel, the creak of the luggage rack when taking a curve. That night, it was full of people who didn't say a word, just looked out the window or at the floor. My dad had to drive that procession as if he were driving through a dream, without honking, without music, without speaking a single word. It was just another job, but with a different weight, and he knew it. That time the procession left Houston heading to Huntsville, a little more than an hour and a half away. The deceased was from there, and they were waiting there to bury him. They left the city later than expected because they were waiting for people. Waiting always put him in a bad mood. There are places, especially toward the north, where it's not advisable to go late, and the reasons can vary depending on who tells it. Apparitions, some say. Organized crime, say others, more practical. Accidents, says everyone. My dad assured that it wasn't a complicated transfer. A little more than an hour, a route he knew backwards and forwards, the same one that leads to Beaumont where my mother is from. When the last person finally got on the bus, they started. It was just sunset. He had the habit of taking a nap before any transfer. Even if it was half an hour, it was enough for him to come out fresh, focused. But that time, as soon as they hit the highway, my dad started feeling strange. It wasn't sleep or physical fatigue. It was something else, like a heaviness that wasn't noticeable on the outside, but felt strong in his muscles. He says he entered that state where one is awake but absent, driving on automatic, as if his hands remembered the route but his mind was very far away. The highway was almost straight. The bus moved smoothly, and the silence, that thick silence of wakes, enveloped him, and then something changed. Suddenly, without understanding how, he realized he was no longer on the highway to Huntsville. The asphalt had been replaced by a narrow, dirt road flanked by dense vegetation. He looked ahead and recognized nothing. He felt like he was inside a capsule. The sounds around him were muffled, distant, as if they came from the other side of a wall. He barely turned his face and saw that there were people standing next to him. They were talking to him, some were touching his shoulder, but he couldn't hear them, couldn't feel the contact. It was like when blood pressure drops suddenly. That dizziness, that floating, that disconnection from reality without warning. He came to suddenly as if someone had pulled his soul back into his body. It was the passengers. They were shaking him. They were urgently asking him to stop. The road wasn't the right one. Everyone knew it, everyone except him. He braked hard. His heart was pounding in his chest. He didn't remember anything. He had been in a trance but had still continued driving. The passengers were terrified. No one was screaming, but their looks spoke for everyone. My father didn't know what to say. His hands were shaking. He didn't even have a voice to apologize or explain why he had gotten off the road. They asked him to open the doors, and then something happened that he never forgot. Between two men and two women, they took a person out of the bus, a motionless, unconscious figure. Maybe they dragged her carefully to a ditch at the side of the road and threw her in. Then they quickly got back on the bus and ordered him to start, and without knowing why, he obeyed. They turned around further ahead, looking to get back on the right road. When passing through the same point where they had stopped, they saw a huge ball of fire in the middle of the field. A strange combustion that illuminated the interior of the bus for a few seconds, leaving marked shadows on faces. No one said anything. Once back on the highway, my dad did the math. They had spent at least 10 minutes off the road. 10 minutes that he didn't remember. 10 minutes with his body at the wheel, but his consciousness somewhere else. While the bus regained the route, a woman, the one traveling right behind him, leaned forward and spoke to him for the first time in the entire journey. Nobody noticed, she told him. But back in Houston, one more person got on. She was one of the first to board and sat up front. She told him that since she got on, she had been getting closer to him little by little. That this woman got very close and started talking in his ear. Everyone thought she was someone he knew, but shortly after, she led him off the road. Someone dared to ask her where she was taking them, but he didn't respond. Others stood up to see him. He was like dazzled, awake, but absent. And then they noticed the strange thing. The woman, what she had in her mouth, didn't speak, but something came out of there, a murmur that only he seemed to hear. She was a witch, and somehow she had hypnotized him to get them off the road. When they arrived at the cemetery, the other cars, the ones that did arrive on time, had been waiting for hours. The first thing they asked was if they were okay, what had happened, why they had taken so long. My father, with his hands still on the steering wheel, kept crossing himself. Sweat was running down his back. It was then that he heard a voice in the back among the people who were walking toward the front to get off the bus. Girl shouldn't have come pregnant to the burial. She brought the witch, said an older woman, serious, without raising her voice. Pregnant women always attract them. My dad stayed in the bus, lying down in 2 seats, waiting for the burial to end. He wasn't sleeping, but trying to disconnect a little from the dense atmosphere that had been breathed since they took the highway. It was then that even with his eyes closed, he noticed an intermittent red glow. At first he thought it was some lamp or the reflection of a car, but no. It was something more irregular, with more life. He sat up, looked out the window, and saw it. There were balls of fire moving around the cemetery. Not many, 4, 5 maybe. They floated at low altitude, moving in slow circles, as if they were watching the terrain, circling the edges of the holy ground. The glow wasn't strong, but it was enough to mark the tombstones, the iron crosses, and the bent figures that were still saying goodbye to the person. They made no noise, didn't approach the center, just wandered floating like buzzards. 3 ladies appeared in front of the bus. My dad was startled because he didn't see them arrive. They came accompanying the pregnant woman, and on behalf of those who hired him, they asked him to take her to Houston as quickly as possible. They left in silence. The girl was sobbing from time to time. From behind came an orange glow, as if it were dawn, although it was barely 12 at night. The drive back was different from the way there. My father kept checking the rearview mirror, not for traffic, but for something else. The pregnant woman sat in the front seat, directly behind him, and he could feel her presence like a weight. She wasn't crying anymore, but her breathing was heavy, labored, as if she were struggling with something invisible. About 20 minutes into the return trip, she spoke for the first time. "I'm sorry," she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear her. "I didn't know I would bring her with me. I didn't know pregnant women called to them." My father wanted to ask what she meant, but his throat felt dry, and the words wouldn't come. In the mirror, he could see her hands resting on her belly, protecting something that was growing inside her. The orange glow from behind was getting stronger, and he pressed harder on the accelerator. "My grandmother told me stories," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "about women who died in childbirth, who couldn't rest because they never got to hold their babies. They're drawn to pregnant women, trying to take what they never had." The temperature in the bus seemed to drop despite the Texas heat. My father reached for the heater controls, but they were already at maximum. The cold was coming from somewhere else, something that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "She got on in Houston," the young woman said. "I saw her at the funeral home, standing in the back corner where the shadows were deepest. She looked like any other mourner, but her eyes," she paused, swallowing hard. "Her eyes were hungry." My father remembered the moment of the trance, the feeling of being pulled away from his own body. Now he understood why the passengers had looked so terrified when he came back to consciousness. They had seen what he couldn't remember, the witch taking control, leading them toward whatever dark purpose she had. "What did they throw in the ditch?" he finally managed to ask. The pregnant woman was quiet for so long he thought she hadn't heard him. Then she said, "What was left of her after we broke the connection. Some things don't die easy, but fire always works." As they approached the Houston city limits, the orange glow behind them finally faded. The young woman's breathing became easier, and the unnatural cold lifted from the bus. But my father never forgot that night, and he never again accepted a funeral job when there was a pregnant woman among the mourners. When they reached the bus station, the young woman got off without another word. She walked into the crowd and disappeared, but not before turning back once to look at my father. In that final glance, he saw something that chilled him more than the supernatural cold had gratitude mixed with a knowledge that she would carry this experience for the rest of her life. My father parked the bus and sat there for a long time, engine off, trying to process what had happened. The garlands and black ribbons were still in place, making the ordinary vehicle look like a vessel that had traveled between worlds. He removed them slowly, methodically, as if the act of undressing the bus could somehow strip away the memory of that journey. But the memory stayed with him. In the weeks that followed, he would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, remembering the feeling of not being in control of his own body. He would dream of dirt roads that led nowhere, of figures in the shadows of funeral homes, of balls of fire dancing around graveyards under starless skies. He started asking questions before accepting funeral jobs. How did the person die? Were there any pregnant women in the family? Had there been any unusual circumstances around the death? His regular clients thought he was becoming superstitious, but he didn't care. Some jobs, he learned, weren't worth the money. One evening, about a month after the incident, my father was cleaning the bus when he found something that made his blood run cold. Wedged between two seats in the back was a small piece of fabric black lace, old and delicate, like something from a vintage dress or veil. It smelled of earth and roses, the kind of roses left on graves. He had cleaned that bus thoroughly after every job, had searched every inch of it multiple times. The fabric hadn't been there before. Someone or something had left it as a reminder. My father burned the fabric that night in our backyard, along with sage his Mexican neighbor had given him. As the flames consumed the lace, he could have sworn he heard something, not quite a scream, not quite a sigh, but something that sounded like relief, like a soul finally letting go. After that, the dreams stopped. My father kept driving the bus for funeral processions, but he became selective about his clients. He developed an instinct for which jobs felt right and which ones carried an undercurrent of something darker. The funeral directors respected his judgment. After all, he had never lost a client or had an accident during a service. Years later, when I was old enough to understand, he told me this story. He said that some roads aren't meant for the living to travel alone, and some passengers aren't meant to reach their destination. He taught me that there are forces in this world that feed on grief and desperation, and that the line between the living and the dead isn't as solid as most people believe. He also told me about the pregnant woman. He had seen her again years later at a grocery store in downtown Houston. She was with a child, a little boy with bright eyes and a quick smile. When she saw my father, she nodded once, a small acknowledgement of their shared experience. The boy was healthy and normal, untouched by whatever darkness had tried to claim him before his birth. Sometimes I think about that night when I'm driving alone on dark highways. I think about my father's hands on the steering wheel, fighting to regain control of his own mind and body. I think about the passengers who had the presence of mind to break the spell and save everyone in that bus. And I think about the forces that still move through the darkness, waiting for moments of vulnerability, for times when our defenses are down, and our grief makes us susceptible to things that should stay buried. My father sold the bus when he turned 65. The new owner was a young man who wanted to start his own transportation company. My father gave him one piece of advice: never accept a job you don't feel right about, no matter how much money they offer. Trust your instincts, especially on the dark roads. The young man laughed and said he didn't believe in that kind of superstition. My father just nodded and walked away. 6 months later, the young man called him, asking if he knew any priests who performed blessings on vehicles. My father gave him a number and never asked what had happened. Some lessons, he knew, can only be learned firsthand. Even now, years after my father's death, when I drive past certain cemeteries at night, I slow down and look for balls of fire floating among the headstones. I've never seen them, but I know they're there. Some things never really leave. They just wait in the shadows for the right moment, the right person, the right combination of grief and vulnerability to make themselves known again. The bus still runs routes through East Texas, painted a different color now, operated by a different company. But sometimes, drivers who work the late shifts report strange things, passengers who get on but never get off, voices that whisper directions to roads that don't exist on any map, and an overwhelming urge to drive toward places where the living aren't supposed to go. They're warned during training about fatigue and hallucinations on long night drives. What they're not told is that some hallucinations are more real than the road beneath their wheels, and some passengers carry tickets to destinations that exist in the spaces between worlds. My name is Ryan Hayes. I'm 35 years old and I work as an industrial designer in Denver. My wife Lucy is a history teacher at a high school. We've been married for 5 years, no kids yet. We're one of those couples who enjoy the quiet, simple things, no parties or drama. That's why when December of last year was approaching, we decided we wanted to spend our vacation away from the city, disconnected. It was Lucy's idea to rent a cabin in the Colorado Rockies. She had been once with her family as a child and remembered the forests, the clean air, and especially the possibility of seeing snow without having to cross state lines. We searched online and found a cabin advertised on a house rental platform. The photos were beautiful: polished wood, fireplace, forest view, total isolation. It said no close neighbors, which for us was perfect. 3 nights for $800, December 22nd to 25th. We booked. Someone with the username Rocky Mountain Retreat responded and sent us the location via direct message, not visible in the ad. They said it was a family property, and that they left the keys under a stone on the porch. On the 22nd, around noon, we left Denver in the car. Driving to the access point took us almost 3 hours. From there, we took a forest road that got lost among sleeping pines covered with frost, with that dry silence that forms in the mountains when snow covers everything. Around 3 in the afternoon, we reached the cabin. We found it operational, but a bit more rustic than expected. There was a low wooden fence, snow accumulated on the roof, and the key was where they said. In the back, behind some trees, you could see a second, smaller construction, like a shed or a small storage cabin. Lucy thought it would be for firewood or tools. Inside, everything smelled like wood and mustiness. It was cold, but with the fireplace lit, it felt cozy. That first night was perfect. We made hot chocolate, watched movies on the laptop, and played cards. 0 cell signal, but we already expected that. We didn't know what was coming. The morning of the 23rd dawned with heavier snowfall. We couldn't leave by car. We decided to stay, read, rest. Lucy started writing in her journal, and I went out to take photos with my camera. I went a bit beyond the cabin's perimeter, following some animal tracks in the snow. But among the trees I stopped. I saw other tracks, human tracks. They went back and forth between the back part of our cabin and the forest, near where that other small construction was. The strange thing was they weren't ours. We hadn't gone out that way, and they were fresh. I returned to the house without saying anything. I didn't want to worry Lucy. In the afternoon, we noticed something else. One of the upstairs windows, where our bedroom was, had fingerprints on the fogged interior glass, like someone had leaned against it with an open hand. It was weird because we didn't remember touching it since we arrived. That night while we were having dinner, we heard footsteps outside, slow ones on the snow. Lucy looked at me, and we both turned off the lights. I ran to peek through a crack next to the door. I didn't see anything, but the footsteps continued. Then a creaking of branches. Something was moving among the trees. I grabbed a log from the fireplace like it was a weapon. We waited in silence for more than half an hour. No more sounds. We turned the lights back on and tried to sleep, although I stayed on the couch with my ears alert. On the 24th morning, I went out to check around the cabin. In the back, I found the surprise. The tracks were still there and led directly to the small cabin in the back. The door of that construction was closed with an old, rusty padlock. But when I got closer, I noticed the latch was loose, like someone would remove it and put it back without hooking it. I got closer, touched the wood. Inside, silence. But when I put my ear to the door, I heard light breathing. Human. I backed away, returned to the cabin, and now I told Lucy everything. The tracks, the footsteps, the hand on the window, and what I had just heard. She got scared, of course, but stayed calm. She told me the best thing was not to provoke anyone, not to get close, and wait for the snow to go down so we could leave. But the storm didn't stop. That afternoon, we tried to communicate via the laptop with the satellite Wi-Fi that was supposed to be in the cabin. It was dead. We tried to go up to a high point with the cell phone. Nothing. As night fell, we heard the footsteps again, and this time they weren't outside. They were heard upstairs on the second floor, like someone was walking over our heads. I ran upstairs, but there was nothing. Closed windows, bathroom door with lock, nothing. I went back down and told Lucy to pack everything. That at the first clear day, we were leaving on foot if necessary. At midnight, while we were trying to sleep, someone knocked on the door. Once, twice, slow, hollow knocks. Lucy screamed, but I covered her mouth. We heard the wood creaking. The footsteps went around the house. At that moment, the fireplace went out by itself, like something had blown from inside. The heat disappeared. Everything was left in twilight. The footsteps continued, and then nothing. We spent the rest of the night awake, knife in hand. At 6:30 in the morning on the 25th, with the snow letting up, we left. We didn't care about leaving things behind. We walked along the trail, sinking up to our shins in some sections, until we finally saw a Forest Service truck patrolling the area pass by. We waved at them like crazy. They took us to the center of Aspen. There we made the report, not for theft, but for invasion or suspicious presence. We thought it was a vagrant, someone hiding on the property. We gave them the exact location. A young officer told us something that left me with chills. That cabin has been abandoned for a while now. Nobody's lived there since 2017, when they found a man locked in the basement of a shed. He had gone in to live there with other people, but when the police arrived, everyone had disappeared. Only he remained. He said he didn't remember how he got there. They never could identify him. He didn't talk, just said, "I was never alone here." "What do you mean nobody lives there?" I asked. "We rented it online. They gave us the location. The keys were on the porch." The agent checked the site. The ad no longer existed. There are people who upload fake properties. They bark more than they bite, but you guys were lucky. Others haven't come out of there. I didn't understand the last part. They took our information, but it didn't go beyond that. Today, almost a year later, Lucy and I haven't talked about the subject with anyone. We haven't gone up to the mountains, and we don't plan to. But sometimes when I dream about that night, I don't just see the silhouette outside. I hear someone else behind us, in the same house, breathing slowly, hidden in the darkness, like they had always been there, waiting for someone to enter the wrong cabin. My name is Ethan Flores. I'm 21 years old, and I'm studying environmental engineering at Colorado State University. I'm telling this story not because it makes sense, or because I expect anyone to believe me. I'm telling it because I haven't been able to get it out of my head for a year now. And I don't even know if what I experienced was real or something that the mountains themselves took care of hiding. I come from a small town in the Colorado Rockies, almost on the border with Wyoming, where the fog comes down to ground level in December, and the roads don't always take you where you think they will. The town is called Pinewood. I grew up among pine forests, cobblestone streets, an old church with a sunken floor, and a bus station that always smells like diesel and reheated burritos. Every December I return home from Denver to spend the holidays with my parents and my two sisters. I always take the same bus, the Mountain Express line that leaves at 5:30 p.m. from the Denver station and arrives in Pinewood after 9 if there are no landslides or thick fog. During holiday season, it's usually full of locals carrying bags with gifts, blankets, piñatas wrapped in black bags, and cardboard boxes tied with rope. But on December 20th, 2023, the trip was different, and I still have no way to explain it. That day I arrived at the Denver station a little after 5. The platform was full of people. I was the second to last to board the bus. It was an old model, one of those with seats upholstered in red vinyl, sliding windows, and the driver's fan hanging with tape. My seat was 14 on the window side. Everything seemed normal. Mothers with sleeping children on their shoulders, ladies with straw hats over their legs, men with downcast looks, all with tired faces. Nobody spoke loudly. The bus radio was off, not a single country song or rock station. Strange. I saw the driver in the mirror, a robust guy, dark-skinned with sparse beard and blue cap. I didn't recognize him. Usually it's Don Pete or his son, drivers of years. This was new, but since I don't like to make a fuss, I got comfortable and took out my headphones. The bus left on time. By the time we passed Vail, the fog was already starting to come down. Up to there, everything like always. But then, just before reaching Silverthorne, what haunts me to this day happened. The bus took a detour I had never seen. It wasn't the normal route. Instead of continuing straight on the mountain highway, it turned onto a secondary road, one of those two-way roads without shoulders, surrounded by pines and with tight curves. I looked around, expecting someone else to get restless, but everyone continued as if nothing. I thought maybe they had closed the main section due to a landslide, but the driver didn't say anything, not over the loudspeaker or quietly. He just turned the wheel, turned off the high beams, and we entered that route where the forest swallowed all sound. I wanted to ask someone, the man in seat 13, for example, but he was sleeping or pretending to sleep. The lady next to me was awake but didn't look at me once. Her face was kind of vacant, eyes fixed forward without blinking. I felt uncomfortable. I started looking out the window. Everything was darkness except for the fog that shone with the bus lights. There were no houses, no posts, no signs, just trees and more trees, until I saw the first sign. It was a wooden board nailed to a crooked post. It said in white paint, "First curve." It wasn't a traffic warning, it wasn't official, just that, first curve. 2 minutes later, another one, second curve. That's when I started feeling a weight in my stomach. Something was wrong, but the worst thing was that nobody, absolutely nobody, seemed to notice. At the fourth curve, I stood up, walked toward the driver, asked him, "Is this the route to Pinewood?" The man didn't respond, just turned to look at me for a second, and in that look I saw something strange. His eyes were completely black, not like a disease, like they were glass, like they reflected everything except me. "Sit down," he said without moving his mouth. I went back to my seat. My hands were shaking. Between the 6th and 7th curves, I saw something else. A car stopped at the side of the road. It had open doors and lights off, like it had been left on purpose. But the most disturbing thing was that it looked rusty, old, like it had been there for years. Then we passed another sign, Curve 8, don't look back. It wasn't until then that I realized that the other passengers were now completely silent. No snoring, no conversation. All with their heads straight, eyes closed or fixed forward. I had the impulse to scream, to demand an explanation, but something stopped me. Maybe fear, maybe the feeling that in that place, any reaction could have consequences. Then I looked out the window and saw him. A man standing in the middle of the forest, barely 10 feet from the road. Quiet, tall, thin, with a dirty straw hat and his face covered by a bandana. He was just there, watching us pass. And then another, the same, at curve 9. And another at 10. Always one more. It was no longer paranoia. Something strange was happening, something that had nothing to do with blockades or detours for construction. At curve 11, I heard a whisper. It wasn't outside, it was inside the bus. I didn't hear it with my ears. I felt it on my neck. Don't get off, don't talk, don't turn around. I froze. When we reached curve number 12, there was no more fog, just pure darkness. The forest had disappeared. Now we were on a dirt road, and the bus started to descend. The sensation was of going down toward something deeper than a ravine, like we were entering an open wound in the mountain. And then, as if it were a bad joke or a broken spell, the bus stopped abruptly. The driver got off. Nobody else moved. I turned off my headphones, lowered my head, waited. I heard them open the rear luggage compartment. I heard footsteps. Something was taken down from the bus, something heavy. I didn't see what. I didn't want to see. A few minutes later, the driver got back on, started the engine, and without saying a word, made a U-turn. We didn't see any more signs. We didn't pass back through the curves. We simply came out again onto the main highway, as if we had made a pause in another dimension. The rest of the trip was silent. Nobody said anything. Nobody got off at previous stops. We all got off when we reached the Pinewood terminal as if nothing had happened. I didn't say anything, not to my parents, not to my sisters, but I knew it. Something had happened. That detour wasn't on any map. Those curves weren't part of any official highway. That delivery at the bottom of the forest wasn't normal, and it wasn't a dream. Days later, I went back to Denver, went to the Mountain Express line module. I asked about the driver from the December 20th trip. The girl at the counter checked her sheet. That day, there was no evening service to Pinewood. We closed the route due to a landslide. I showed her my ticket. She frowned. This number doesn't correspond to any of our trips. Look, this isn't even one of our tickets. We haven't used this format since 2020. I was frozen. Since then, every December I think twice before returning to town. I know that something came down that night, that the driver knew, and that the others did too, everyone except me. I was the only new one, the only one who shouldn't have been there, the only one who asked. Now when someone talks to me about mountain folklore, about the strange things seen in the mountains, I just smile, because there are roads that aren't on the maps, and there are routes that don't take you home, but to places you shouldn't know. Places where what gets off the bus isn't always suitcases. And once you take that trip, you never forget the 12 curves. I'm going to hide behind anonymity to tell this story. And I also ask that the people to whom what I'm going to tell you happened remain nameless. A guy I know drove a city bus, a transit bus, whatever you might know it as. One night he took the unit to the depot, got off to open the sliding door, got back on the bus, entered the maneuvering yard, got off to close it. And when he got back on to take the bus to the back, he managed to see that someone was sitting in the second to last seats. He asked him to get off as a rule. No one should stay there. But since they were already inside the depot, he couldn't simply ask him to get off. He had to take him out to the street. The driver got up fearfully, and the stranger did too. He walked toward the open door, and before he could do anything, he got off. The driver got off almost immediately, but when he turned around to catch up with him, he simply didn't find him. He must have hidden. The guy checked other vehicles in the depot. Some had their doors open, others didn't. The place was huge, with 1,000 spaces where someone could slip away. Well, he'll just have to stay locked in, he thought at first, until when he got on to check one last bus, he managed to hear someone running across the roof of the vehicle. He stopped for a second. Then he thought about calling someone for help. When other coworkers arrived, they checked every corner where he could have hidden. Only the bathrooms remained. When they tried to open one of them, they noticed that the door wouldn't give. It was stuck from the inside. They threatened to knock it down. From inside, they managed to hear a kind of dry laugh, almost choked. One of them kicked the door hard. When it opened, a cloud of flies shot out, invading the entire depot. They found no one, but at that moment they decided to keep quiet, cross themselves, and leave. After that night, strange things started happening to the driver. A few days later, when he was on his route, he managed to hear someone ring the bell to request a stop. He looked in the mirror, and the aisle was empty. It wasn't unusual for someone to do it as a joke, but this time he couldn't see anyone or any movement in the seats. He stopped anyway to be safe. He opened the door and waited a moment, but no one got off. The first time he thought he might have been confused, but it happened again the next day and the next, with passengers or alone on the route, or when he was going to turn in the bus at the end of the shift. It always happened the same way. When reaching the same point, the same deserted intersection where no one ever got off, the bell would ring again, a clear sound that couldn't be attributed to an electrical error. He tried to think around the issue so as not to get scared. Maybe it's a loose contact, a wire that was grounding with the vibration, he thought. But it wasn't when going over a speed bump, or when braking suddenly, or when hitting a pothole. It was always in that same place. He kept working, although every time he entered that intersection, he gripped his hands on the steering wheel and looked in the mirror by reflex, expecting to see a passenger ringing the bell. And it wasn't just the bell. Sometimes when he was en route late at night and reached a red light, something worse happened. The bus, stopped and almost silent, would suddenly start shaking. It wasn't a light movement like the wind hitting the body, but a clear tremor, as if they were pushing it. At first he thought it was fatigue, that it was his head playing tricks on him, until he looked in the mirror and managed to make out people around the bus. They were men, several surrounding the unit. They approached the metal and put their open hands against the body, hitting it at the same time as if to make him react. They didn't scream, they didn't talk, they didn't make any sound, but they were there. He tried to focus his gaze well to distinguish them. They had human features, yes, but their faces were turned off, as if covered by a kind of black shadow that couldn't fade even with the light from the headlights. They looked like people, but he couldn't see their eyes, nose, mouth. Just a dark stain where a face should go. While they kept hitting the bus, he felt a cold creeping up his back, a weight in his chest that almost didn't let him breathe. When the light changed to green and he managed to pick up speed, all those people disappeared at the same time as if they had never been there. It happened over and over again, almost always at the same traffic lights. Once during a night shift, a passenger got on that he would never forget. She was a little old lady with a slow walk, with a dark shawl covering her head. She paid him with coins, passed by the driver, and when he approached to give her change, he heard her mutter something that froze his blood. "You're going to hell if everyone gets off and we're left alone. I'll rip your throat out." He managed to hear her clearly, almost like a breath next to his ear. He turned immediately to confront her, but the woman continued on her way down the aisle slowly, almost dragging her shoes and with her head down. It seemed like she hadn't said anything, but he couldn't have imagined it. He tried to calm down and continued the route. However, little by little the unit was emptying. One by one, all the passengers got off, and the little old lady was still there, motionless in her seat. Through the mirror, he could make her out in the back looking at him all the time, and he couldn't stop thinking about those words. When the last passenger finally got off, the old woman lifted her head. The driver managed to see in the mirror how she stood up, how she started walking toward the front almost without making noise, but with an attitude that wasn't human. He pulled over immediately, braked hard, and before she was close, he opened the door and ran out. He didn't think about anything else but putting all possible distance between him and that figure that was approaching. He didn't stop until he reached a patrol car. Breathless, almost with a sob in his throat, he asked the officers to take him to the station. There his hands trembled as he took out his license, trying to organize his ideas to say what he was going to say. But before an officer could ask him what was wrong, he released a confession he had been dragging for some time. He confessed that he had run over someone who, according to him, he didn't see crossing. He was alone that night. There were no witnesses. No one managed to come out to confront him, and he simply didn't stop. Since then, every time he passed by that place, there where a dark stain was marked on the pavement, he couldn't help but think about the person who was left lying there. Sometimes he managed to distinguish her standing next to the sidewalk, raising her hand to ask for the stop, looking at him fixedly. That obviously wasn't a living passenger, so he never had the courage to brake. He tried not to look. He passed faster, gritting his teeth so as not to face the weight of that gaze that seemed to accompany him along the way. But one day, while he was distracted with the phone in his hand, he managed to read a news story related to that accident. His heart skipped a beat, thinking that someone could identify him. He raised his gaze to resume the road and managed to see someone flagging him down. He stopped, opened the door, and a person got on. He closed and continued his route. He looked up to receive payment, but the person continued straight. He looked in the mirror, but couldn't distinguish the passenger among all the others. Until that moment, he hadn't realized where he had made the stop. That same place where the accident had occurred. All the time he felt a kind of pressure on the back of his neck, a cold that didn't give way, as if they were watching him from the back of the bus. Pay attention, because that was the same night that he put the unit in the depot, and someone snuck in sitting in the last seats. Since then, every shift became a sentence. He was no longer able to distinguish if it was his guilt, if he was imagining it, or if the voices telling him were real. Turn yourself in, damn murderer, turn yourself in. In the end, he couldn't stand it. He turned himself in to end the wait, to at least give a name to the crime he had committed. And although he's now in prison, the person who told me this story, his wife, swears that not even in jail have they left him alone. She assures that every night they pull his feet, that he wakes up screaming, looking toward a corner where no one should be. But where, according to him, that same stranger still stands, raising his hand, flagging down the bus. The prison guards say they've heard him talking to someone in his cell late at night, having full conversations as if someone were there with him. When they check, they always find him alone, sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at the empty corner. The other inmates have started requesting cell changes. They say the temperature drops when they walk past his door, and sometimes they hear footsteps pacing back and forth when they know he's asleep. His wife visits him every Thursday. She says his eyes have changed, that he looks through people now instead of at them. During their last visit, he told her he's learned the passenger's name. He said the dead man introduced himself, that they talk every night about forgiveness and justice. She asked him what the name was, but he just smiled and said she wouldn't believe him anyway. The chaplain at the prison has been trying to help him, conducting what he calls spiritual counseling sessions. But even the chaplain admits there's something unusual about the case. He says the cell feels different when he enters, heavy with a presence that makes it hard to concentrate on prayer. Sometimes, when he's reading scripture aloud, he hears what sounds like a second voice, whispering the words along with him. The driver's lawyer tried to appeal his case, arguing temporary insanity, but the driver refused. He said he deserves whatever punishment comes, that running away was the real crime, not the accident itself. He told the judge that he's already serving his sentence anyway, that the real court is in session every night when the lights go out. Last month, there was an incident in the prison laundry where he works. Witnesses say they saw him having an animated conversation with someone while folding sheets, gesturing and nodding as if receiving instructions. When a guard approached, he was alone, but the sheet he'd been folding was somehow tied in a perfect noose. He claimed he didn't remember making it. His wife has started having nightmares too. She dreams of riding an empty bus through a city she doesn't recognize, where all the stops are graveyards, and the only passenger is a figure in the back who never gets off. In the dream, she's the driver, and no matter how fast she goes or what route she takes, she can never escape that stare in the rearview mirror. The bus company retired his old route after 3 replacement drivers quit within a month. They all reported the same things, the bell ringing at that intersection, the figures around the bus at red lights, the feeling of being watched. The route was eventually discontinued, officially due to low ridership, but the drivers knew the real reason. Sometimes his wife drives past the intersection where it all started. There's a small memorial now, flowers that someone she doesn't know who keeps fresh. She never stops, never gets out to look closer, but she swears that sometimes in her peripheral vision, she sees a figure standing at the bus stop, hand raised, still waiting for a ride that will never come. I had just started working at the marketing firm downtown. Still getting to know everyone, still trying to find my place in the office dynamics. One of my coworkers, Jake, who I'd been grabbing lunch with occasionally, mentioned that he and his girlfriend Sarah were planning a weekend getaway with some friends up at Lake Tahoe. "You should come along," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "We rented this amazing house with a pool. There's room for one more, and honestly, it'd be good for you to meet more people outside the office." He was persistent about it, said it would be a perfect chance to unwind, to get away from the city for a couple days. I figured, why not? I was new to San Francisco, didn't know many people outside of work, and a weekend by the lake sounded exactly like what I needed. We were 14 people total, but since I was the last to join, they split the cost 13 ways. The house was one of those vacation rentals you see all over Tahoe modern mountain architecture, with floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed wooden beams, and a deck that overlooked the water. Some of us drove up in Jake's SUV, others took their own cars. The drive through the Sierra Nevada was beautiful, winding mountain roads with glimpses of the lake sparkling through the pine trees. When we arrived Friday evening, everything seemed perfect. The house was even better than the photos online. Clean white walls, polished concrete floors that reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through those massive windows. The kitchen had a sleek granite island where we could all gather. And there was a living room with sectional sofas that could probably sleep half our group. Outside, a wooden deck wrapped around the back of the house, leading to what looked like an infinity pool that seemed to blend right into the lake beyond. Most of the faces were new to me, but everyone was welcoming. We stopped at a Safeway in Tahoe City to stock up on groceries and beer. Made several trips actually, loading up on steaks for the grill, bags of chips, bottles of wine, and enough Corona to last the weekend. Throughout Friday night and all of Saturday, nothing seemed off. We grilled burgers, played beer pong on the deck, took turns jumping into the pool. The water was deeper than it looked in the listing photos, but refreshingly cold. Saturday night we stayed up late, probably until 3 in the morning. Found this local taco truck that someone recommended authentic Mexican food with fresh tortillas and that spicy green salsa that burns your tongue but keeps you coming back for more. I hadn't had that much fun in months. Just the kind of carefree weekend I needed after the stress of starting a new job in a new city. The weird stuff started when we got back to the house. We crashed wherever we could find space. The house had 4 bedrooms, but with 14 people, most of us ended up on the sectional sofas or air mattresses scattered around the living room. I remember falling asleep on one of the leather couches, listening to the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. I woke up around 9 in the morning, but I could tell something was wrong before I even opened my eyes. The light was all wrong. Every window in the house had been covered with heavy blackout curtains that definitely weren't there the night before. These weren't the light linen curtains that had been hanging when we arrived. These were thick, almost industrial-looking fabric that blocked out every ray of sunlight. But that wasn't the strangest part. Every single light in the house was on, casting everything in this deep, aggressive red glow. The same warm white lead bulbs that had lit our evening were now burning crimson, like we were inside some kind of darkroom for developing photographs. I found myself lying on the hardwood floor, even though I distinctly remembered falling asleep on the couch. Maybe I got too warm and moved, I thought, though the air conditioning was still running, creating this low mechanical drone from the ceiling vents. I stumbled toward the kitchen, my head pounding with the kind of hangover that starts behind your eyes and radiates outward. My mouth felt like cotton, desperately needing water or orange juice, or anything to cut through the metallic taste coating my tongue. The kitchen was dark except for that red light. When I flipped the switch, the same crimson glow filled the space. Someone had taped newspaper over all the windows, not just any newspaper, but what looked like old yellowed pages, like they'd been sitting in someone's garage for years. That definitely wasn't there when we arrived. I would have noticed something that obvious. Near the sink, I found 3 gauze pads soaked with what looked like blood. Dark, dried patches that had turned almost black around the edges. Next to them, 3 glass bottles of different sizes, a wine bottle, a mason jar, and something that might have been an old Coke bottle, each filled with a dark liquid that could have been wine, could have been something worse. I went looking for the others. They were scattered around the house like discarded dolls, sprawled on floors in bedrooms and hallways with doors hanging open. Everyone was on the ground, even though we'd all found comfortable places to sleep the night before. The red light fixtures cast everything in this hellish glow that made everyone's skin look pale and sickly. When the thought crossed my mind that maybe we were trapped, that something had happened to us during the night, I hurried toward one of the covered windows. I was barefoot and slipped on something warm and wet, a puddle that smelled distinctly of urine. The smell made my stomach turn as I carefully made my way to the window and yanked down the newspaper. The contrast was violent. Bright Sierra Nevada sunlight flooded in, temporarily blinding me and making me lose my balance again. The difference between the red interior and the brilliant mountain daylight was so stark it felt like emerging from a cave. I moved through the house slowly, pressing my palms against my temples to stop the throbbing. Others started waking up one by one. Everyone had the same confused expression, the same questions about why we were all on the floor, why the house looked like a scene from a horror movie. We started cleaning up, pulling down the newspaper, turning off the red lights, sweeping up beer bottles and paper plates with leftover food. But the atmosphere was heavy. Nobody was making jokes or talking about the night before. That easy camaraderie from Saturday had evaporated completely. Then we noticed something else. 4 of the girls in our group were acting strange. They'd been together all weekend, but now they were huddled in one corner of the living room, whispering among themselves and shooting glances at the rest of us like they knew something they weren't ready to share. I asked if anyone remembered going to sleep on the floor. Nobody did. I asked if anyone remembered the red lights or the newspaper on the windows. Blank stares all around. One guy, Marcus, who hadn't been drinking at all because he was driving back early, woke up in the same confused state as everyone else. We couldn't agree on what to do about breakfast. The house felt divided now. Those of us who were completely confused about what had happened during the night, and those 4 girls who kept exchanging meaningful looks but wouldn't explain what they knew. Finally, Sarah Jake's girlfriend told us what the others had been reluctant to say. During the early morning hours, while the rest of us were unconscious, something had happened to Emma, the girl who woke up alone in the master bedroom instead of on the living room floor with everyone else. The other girls suspected that one of the guys had attacked her. Looking around the house, the red lights, the gauze pads, the strange bottles, it was hard to blame them for being suspicious. The whole scene looked like evidence of something terrible. But their questions were terrifying no matter how you looked at them. Who had changed all the light bulbs to red, and why? The pool water had taken on a reddish tint, and there were small crosses scratched into the walls with what looked like white candle wax, barely visible unless you knew where to look. What happened next caught everyone off guard. The four girls managed to lock all the doors and windows from the inside, trapping the rest of us in the house with them. They said nobody was leaving until we figured out what had happened to Emma. It seemed fair enough. I'd only known these people for one day. I had no idea what anyone was capable of, what secrets they might be hiding. For 2 hours, nobody knew what to do. Nobody offered explanations. Nobody confessed to anything. Picture the mood hungover, exhausted, trapped, and afraid, without even a single cup of coffee to help clear our heads. It was almost noon when one of the girls decided to call the owner of the house. She asked if he could help us access the security cameras, if he could show us the footage from the night before. I don't know exactly what she told him, but the man arrived quickly. He knocked on the door and asked to speak only with the girls. He brought a tablet with him and showed them the available video footage, one camera pointed at the driveway and street, another focused on the pool area. There were no cameras inside the house. After viewing the footage, they came back inside and unlocked the doors. Their apologies weren't the perfunctory kind you give when you're just going through the motions. These were real, heartfelt apologies, but there was something different in their expressions now. Not anger or suspicion, but a deeper kind of fear. They told us that what had happened to Emma was far more disturbing than they'd initially thought. The owner asked us to leave immediately. One of the girls tried to gather up the trash bags to take them out to the curb, but he told her to leave everything exactly as it was. He didn't want to see any of us on his property for another minute. Those were honestly the most tense minutes of my life, not knowing what had occurred, understanding only that whatever it was felt dark and unacceptable, and was still lingering in the atmosphere around us. I learned the truth on the drive back to San Francisco. Jake told me what Sarah had shared with him about what they saw in the security footage. The driveway camera showed nothing unusual. No one entered the property, no one left, no vehicles, no strangers. But the pool camera told a different story. It activated around 3:30 in the morning. The motion sensor light came on automatically. The owner swore he never checked those recordings unless there was a break-in, and there had been a burglary at the house 6 months earlier that made him install the system. In the footage, they saw something enter the property. The image wasn't clear. It looked like a technical glitch, a distortion that moved across the frame like static interference. But there was definitely a presence there, something that affected the video quality just by being recorded. What they could see clearly was Emma. She came out of the house on her own, walked to the edge of the pool, and stared into the water. She stood there motionless for almost 2 minutes, as if she was watching something move beneath the surface, trying to understand what she was seeing. Then something emerged from the pool. What little they could make out wasn't enough to form a complete picture. At first glance, it looked like a man tall, powerfully built, naked, commanding, but also terrifying. When they tried to focus on the footage, the figure seemed to dissolve, as if something in the image resisted being captured completely. It distorted and shifted. The outline of the body rippled slightly, like it was out of focus. The arms were longer than normal, extending almost to the knees, and moved with a calculated, unnatural slowness. The face was the most disturbing part, an expression frozen between laughter and screaming. Mouth stretched unnaturally wide, eyes deep and hollow, without light, without any clear direction. It didn't seem to be looking at anyone specifically, but you felt like it was staring directly at you. An expression completely devoid of human emotion. No horns, no wings, but clearly demonic in its impossible presence. I can't go into details about what happened between them during the following 9 minutes, but it was obviously consensual. She made no attempt to escape, didn't scream, didn't call for help. In fact, she moved in rhythm with it, embracing, holding tight, making soft sounds. At some point, they both stopped moving and the automatic light turned off. At the 12-minute mark, the floodlight came back on. That's when the rest of us appeared in the footage, all of us who were supposed to be sleeping, but we didn't look conscious. We simply walked outside, moved to the pool, and stared into the bottom where she was floating. The water had turned red. Several of us pulled the girl out of the pool. Her friends wrapped her in towels and helped her back inside. 10 seconds later, the camera shut off. End of recording because there was no more movement to detect. I found out later through Jake, who heard it from Sarah, that Emma had become pregnant. But at 6 weeks, she lost the baby. That's how she described it, the baby, because what she miscarried wasn't human. She said she expelled an enormous clot that had no human form. Something that looked more like a snake, a reddish mass, more elongated than normal, gelatinous, that moved on its own and seemed to be watching her. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.